Beneath Colorado's mountains and mesas lie stories. Science still can't untangle vanished civilizations, unfinished temples, artifacts frozen in ice, and whole chapters of Earth's history simply missing. Some of these mysteries are ancient, etched into stone and silence. Others are startlingly recent, as if the land itself still swallows secrets. Tonight, we descend into Colorado's pre-flood past, where numbers don't add up, names dissolve, and monuments whisper riddles no one can solve. Welcome to 2 hours of questions without answers, and answers that only deepen the questions. Before we dive into the first mystery, a quick note: if you love unraveling the unsolvable, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next descent into the unknown. And since you're here with me in this late-night labyrinth, I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now, and what time shows on your clock as these echoes reach you? Mesa Verde collapse. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde cling to the sandstone alcoves like the ribcage of some long-dead titan, bones etched against the horizon. You can almost hear them breathe when the wind whips through the empty kivas. For centuries, they stood as the crown jewel of the ancestral Puebloans, the civilization that built into the rock itself, a feat that feels both alien and intimate. And then, sometime around the late 1200 seconds, they simply left. No smoking ruins, no battle scars etched into the walls, no neatly scrawled farewell note for future archaeologists. Just absence, as if an entire community had packed up and vanished while the corn still withered in its stalks. Historians argue, of course. That's what historians do. Drought is the favored explanation, always drought, the Swiss Army knife of ancient collapse theories. And yes, tree ring data suggests the late 13th century was dry, unforgiving, the kind of drought that turns soil into cracked parchment. But drought doesn't usually make people abandon elaborate fortified cliff dwellings that could serve as shelters in lean times. If anything, you'd expect them to cling tighter. Then there's the story of conflict, neighbors turning against neighbors when the corn failed, raids from outside groups eager to pillage what little remained. Excavated skeletons tell of trauma, fractured skulls, arrow points embedded in bone, but violence alone doesn't explain the scale. Mesa Verde wasn't a single village, it was a network of dozens of settlements, hundreds of people, maybe thousands, entire canyons emptied in less than a century. If it was war, it was a war that rewrote the landscape. Others suggest religion, some cosmic shift in belief, a prophecy that told them their time in the cliffs was over. The kivas whisper hints of ceremonies we'll never fully decode, burn marks around ritual spaces, symbols etched in stone, part calendar, part prayer. Was it an exodus dictated not by survival, but by faith? Imagine them leaving, not because they had to, but because they believed they must. The cruelest twist? We know where some of them went. Down to the Rio Grande Valley, west toward the Hopi Mesas, south to the Zuni lands. They didn't evaporate into thin air, they transformed, rerouted. And yet, the great cliff palaces were never reoccupied. Not by their descendants, not by anyone. As if the place itself had been marked untouchable, taboo, a skeleton of memory that no one dared to animate again. You stand in Cliff Palace today and look at the hundreds of windows carved into the stone, and your brain instinctively imagines faces staring back. But they're not there, just black voids. And the silence is worse than ruins. It feels intentional. Scientists, of course, keep chiseling at the puzzle. Paleoethnobotanists track corncob, remains like detectives at a crime scene, trying to reconstruct diet. Climate scientists model rainfall patterns. Archaeologists map migration routes with pottery shards as breadcrumbs. But every discipline keeps finding something slippery. Contradictions, half-truths, unresolved threads. The more they study, the more the collapse feels less like a clean break and more like an unraveling political, environmental, spiritual, personal. And yet, there's a lingering unease. Because Mesa Verde isn't just a story about people long gone. It's a mirror. A civilization with architecture beyond its time, cultural complexity, astronomical knowledge, and yet vulnerable to forces, climate, conflict, ideology that hollowed it out in less than a lifetime. They thought the cliffs would last forever. The stone still does. The people didn't. It's tempting to tell ourselves we've outgrown this fragility, that skyscrapers and satellites guarantee permanence. But maybe that's just our modern cliff-dwelling illusion, comfortable alcoves carved into a canyon wall, waiting for the moment when silence decides it's our turn. Which brings us to the next riddle carved into stone, the Sun Temple. A structure so precise in its geometry that it hints at a knowledge both mathematical and mystical. Built not for shelter, but for something deeper, something that makes the Mesa Verde exodus even stranger. If they were so advanced, why couldn't they hold on? And what exactly were they measuring, aligning, or worshipping on that mesa top before walking away? Sun Temple geometry. On the flat top of Mesa Verde, above the canyons where cliff dwellings crouch in their sandstone alcoves, lies something different. It is not a home. It is not a fortress. It is not even a kiva in the traditional sense. It is a structure with walls waist-high, laid out with a precision that feels strangely mathematical, almost surgical. Archaeologists call it the Sun Temple, though that name is just a guess, a title thrown at the enigma because it sounds suitably mystical. Here's the part that unsettles the scientists. The temple is geometric. Not haphazard geometry either, but clean alignments, right angles, golden rectangles, and triangles that fit neatly into the Pythagorean theorem. In other words, a structure that suggests either extraordinary intuition or a standardized unit of measurement. And if it's the latter, then the ancestral Puebloans were doing something far more advanced than just stacking stones into ceremonial walls. They were thinking in systems, numbers, proportions. The story goes like this. Sometime around 1200 CE, when the cliff dwellings below were bustling with life, builders came up to the mesa top and began to shape sandstone blocks into a rectangle 120 feet across. The walls were double-lined, the stone carefully pecked and fitted. Inside, two circular features, the so-called towers, were placed not at random, but at points that suggest careful planning. When modern researchers overlaid the structure with geometrical patterns, the results were unnervingly precise. Ratios consistent with golden rectangles, layouts consistent with known mathematical rules. A consistent measurement unit, roughly 30.5 centimeters, popping up again and again like a hidden code. And here's the kicker, nobody knows why. This wasn't a living space. There are no hearths, no household debris, no corn-grinding stones. It wasn't defensive, no roofs, no walls tall enough to fend off enemies. It wasn't even finished. The walls rise to a certain height, then stop, as if the builders either lost interest or deliberately froze the project halfway. An unfinished temple, geometrically pure but functionally mysterious, left on the mesa top like an equation missing its final line. One theory is astronomy. Maybe this was meant as a grand observatory, its angles aligned with solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills. Researchers love to draw lines between its walls and celestial points, arguing that the temple was a stage for watching the sky. That would fit the name. It would also fit the broader theme of Puebloan culture, where stars, sun, and moon were woven into ceremonies. But here's the problem. The alignments don't perfectly match. Some do, but some don't. Enough to cast doubt. Enough to make the skeptics shake their heads and mutter that we might be imposing our obsession with geometry onto something that was, at its core, symbolic. Another theory is ritual. The temple might have been a space where numbers and proportions mattered not for science, but for spirituality. A golden rectangle as a kind of cosmic blueprint. A unit of measure as a sacred rhythm, the way chants rely on beats. Imagine ceremonies unfolding inside the rectangle, the human body moving in synchronization with proportions thought to reflect the universe itself. Not science as we think of it, but sacred math, the geometry of belief. And then, of course, there's the nihilistic possibility. Maybe the geometry is coincidence. Maybe we're overreading, projecting our golden rectangles onto walls that were never meant to be perfect. Humans, after all, are pattern-hungry creatures. Give us a cracked ceiling and we'll find constellations. But if that's the case, if it really was nothing more than an unfinished ritual space, why did the builders insist on repeating that oddly consistent unit of 30.5 centimeters? Why standardize anything at all if meaning didn't matter? What makes the Sun Temple so unnerving isn't just its mystery, it's its timing. It was being built right around the same period when Mesa Verde was sliding toward collapse. While people below struggled with drought, migration, and uncertainty, someone up here was building a geometric monument to something. Perhaps hope, perhaps power, perhaps resignation. And then, like everything else, it was abandoned. Its geometry frozen in stone, never completed, never explained. The silence surrounding the Sun Temple is heavier than the silence in the cliff dwellings. The dwellings whisper of absence, of lives interrupted. The temple whispers of intention without resolution. A riddle left in architectural form, not erased but unfinished. Scientists try to resolve it with measuring tapes and software, overlaying diagrams, running calculations. They still can't explain why a culture that left so little written record would suddenly decide to standardize measurements, or why they'd care about golden rectangles centuries before Europeans would use them to sculpt cathedrals. Was this independent discovery? Or was it an echo of knowledge carried from far older, far stranger origins? And if the geometry was deliberate, then what about the sky? The alignments, though imperfect, suggest at least some kind of astronomical function. Which drags us into the next puzzle, perhaps the most tantalizing one. Was the Sun Temple also an observatory? Were its walls and towers less about proportion and more about tracking the eternal movements above? If the ground could no longer be trusted, if crops failed and people starved, maybe the heavens held the only reliable calendar. Maybe the math was never about walls at all. It was about the stars. The Sun Temple leaves us with more questions than answers. Geometry without a script, rituals without a record. And speaking of unfinished stories, if you haven't yet subscribed, now's the time. This channel is where unsolved history comes alive. While you're at it, drop a comment below. Where are you listening from? And what time is it on your end as we walk through these ruins together? Sun Temple astronomy. The walls of the Sun Temple at Mesa Verde don't just whisper numbers and proportions, they cast shadows. And when you start watching those shadows, you realize they may not have been accidents at all. Archaeologists and archaeoastronomers have long speculated that the temple wasn't just a geometric riddle. It might have been a skywatcher's stage. The geometry, in this reading, was not merely decorative or symbolic, but functional lines and angles stretched toward the heavens, anchoring cosmic events into stone. Picture it, the mesa top, bare and open to the horizon. From up here, the cliff dwellings look small, tucked into their rocky alcoves. The temple walls stand in partial form, waist-high, framing a space that never quite became a building. But look closer. From certain points, the walls align with the rising or setting sun at the solstices. They point toward the horizon where lunar standstills occur every 18.6 years. Some even trace star paths alignments with bright constellations like Orion or the Pleiades. At least, that's what the researchers argue. They map the walls, chart the sightlines, calculate the azimuths, and sometimes things line up too well to ignore. Other times, they don't. Some alignments are uncanny, precise to fractions of a degree. Others are off, sloppy, as though the builders didn't care about perfection. Which raises the uncomfortable possibility, were they astronomers in the way we imagine, Or were they simply embedding the sky into their rituals in ways that obeyed logic we no longer understand? Because here's the unsettling part. If the Sun Temple really was an observatory, it means the ancestral Puebloans had not just an intuitive sense of geometry, but a practical mastery of celestial cycles. The solstices are obvious, you can track those with a stick in the ground. But lunar standstills? Those are trickier. They require watching the moon rise and set over decades, charting its slow oscillation across the horizon. 18 years of patient observation translated into stone alignments. That's not just sky watching. That's long-term planning, generational memory, cultural commitment to the clockwork of the cosmos. Why would a people on the brink of environmental collapse build something so elaborate? One theory: they were desperate. When droughts cut into crops and social structures frayed, the people may have turned to the sky, searching for meaning, reassurance, or instructions. If the rains failed, maybe the heavens could tell them why. Maybe ceremonies aligned with the stars could coax the world back into balance. The temple, unfinished though it was, could have been the ultimate act of faith, one last attempt to bargain with the universe. But another interpretation is colder. Maybe it wasn't desperation. Maybe it was power. Imagine leaders or priests using the temple to demonstrate their control over time itself. To stand in front of the people and declare, with confidence, that the sun would rise here on this date, the moon there in this season, to appear as intermediaries between mortals and the cosmos. In that reading, the temple wasn't just science or spirituality, it was politics, control disguised as prophecy. And then, the great irony. It failed. The temple was abandoned before its walls were even finished. Whatever ceremonies were meant to unfold inside its geometry, whatever stars it was meant to track, they never stabilized a world in collapse. The droughts continued, the people scattered, the sky moved on, indifferent, while the unfinished walls crumbled, a monument to both knowledge and futility. Today, tourists shuffle along the mesa top, snapping pictures, walking past the low stone outlines. Few stop to imagine the nights when this was alive with torches, chants, and eyes fixed on the horizon. Few realize that this bare rectangle might represent centuries of accumulated astronomical wisdom, wisdom that never made it into writing, wisdom that lived only in observation and memory, and then vanished when the people did. Scientists still argue. Some insist the alignments are real, that the ancestral Puebloans mastered cycles of sun and moon. Others dismiss the idea as projection, our modern obsession with precision superimposed on something symbolic. The debate never resolves, because the builders left no texts, no explanatory notes, no guides to decode their intentions. The temple, like the stars, refuses to answer. And maybe that's the point. The temple doesn't tell us what they knew. It tells us what they sought. Patterns in the sky, meaning in the void, certainty in a world that was slipping out of control. And in that, it feels disturbingly familiar. Because even now, with satellites and algorithms, we still stare upward, searching for meaning in the heavens, reading cycles, waiting for signs, hoping for control. And perhaps that's the cruelest connection. The Sun Temple is not ancient superstition, but an echo of our own need to tame the infinite. Which brings us, naturally, to the next enigma, the Lindenmeier site. A place where, long before temples or cliff dwellings, hunters carried tools and materials across vast distances, trading and moving in ways we still don't fully understand. If the Sun Temple represents the mystery of time and the heavens, Lindenmeier represents the mystery of movement and connection, how far people would go, and what they carried with them. Lindenmeier site trade origins. The Lindenmeier site doesn't look like much at first glance, just rolling grassland near the Pueblo River in northern Colorado, dotted with sagebrush and framed by distant ridges. If you were driving past, you'd probably never guess it was once one of the most important gathering spots for Ice Age hunters in North America. No pyramids here, No dramatic cliff dwellings clinging to stone, just a flat, quiet expanse. But dig into the soil, and suddenly you're knee-deep in mystery. Back in the 1930 seconds, crews uncovered what turned out to be one of the largest Folsom culture sites ever found. Folsom, that's the label archaeologists give to a group of Paleo-Indians living around 12,000 years ago, right after the Ice Age loosened its grip. They're best known for their distinctive fluted spear points, works of stonecraft so finely made, they almost look machined. At Lindenmeier, those points were everywhere, scattered like breadcrumbs across the prairie. Alongside them, animal bones, tools, and debris from long, long seasons of life. It was not a campsite, but a hub, a place where hundreds of people gathered over generations. And here's where things get strange. Some of the materials found at Lindenmeier didn't belong there. The stone used to make tools wasn't always local. In fact, some came from hundreds of miles away from the Texas Panhandle, from Wyoming, from the Dakotas. Imagine that. Hunters hauling raw stone across plains, or trading it hand-to-hand across networks that spanned entire regions. We like to imagine Paleo-Indians as isolated bands scratching out a living, but Lindenmeier complicates that. It suggests long-distance connections, a kind of prehistoric trade route crisscrossing the continent. But how exactly did that work? That's the question science still can't answer. Were there centralized gatherings where different groups met to exchange goods, stories, and marriage partners? Was Lindenmeier itself one of those ancient trade fairs, like a prehistoric version of a county fairground where everyone showed up once a year? Or were these materials passed slowly along the landscape, traded from one group to the next, each exchange stretching a little farther until obsidian or flint arrived hundreds of miles from its source? The site forces uncomfortable questions, because it wasn't just stone that moved, it was ideas. The Folsom Point itself is evidence of a shared technology, spreading across vast regions. A carefully crafted fluted spear point found in Colorado looks nearly identical to one found in New Mexico. That level of consistency suggests communication, teaching, even apprenticeship. Someone, somewhere, started shaping stone in this unique way, and the knowledge radiated outward. Lindenmeier was plugged into that network, but how and why remain unknown. And then there's the matter of scale. When you find exotic stone in a single artifact, you can brush it off as an anomaly. But at Lindenmeier, you find enough to prove this wasn't random. Something systematic was happening. People either moved long distances themselves, or they were connected through webs of exchange. Either way, it means Ice Age Colorado wasn't isolated. It was connected to a continent-wide story. Scientists have tried to reconstruct the trade routes. They plot stone sources on maps, trace the likeliest corridors across plains and river valleys, but the lines are speculative. No written records, no trails, no villages preserved, just fragments of rock, silent and unyielding. The mystery remains. How far did they travel? How wide were their circles? And what did those journeys mean to the people making them? Some archaeologists suggest the trade wasn't purely economic, it may have been ceremonial. Certain stones might have held symbolic power. Carrying a piece of obsidian from far away could have been more than practical. It could have been a marker of status, identity, or belief. Imagine standing at Lindenmeier, holding a fluted point made of stone that came from the Black Hills. You're not just holding a tool, you're holding a connection, proof that your people belong to something larger than the horizon you see. And yet, when you strip it down, you still face silence. The site is massive, but it tells only half a story. We know they gathered. We know they hunted bison bones lie scattered in abundance, cracked open for marrow, stacked in refuse piles. We know they carried stones from far away. But why this place? Why here? And why then? The soil won't say. The irony is that Lindenmeier is more famous to scientists than to the public. Mesa Verde has cliff palaces you can tour, Sun Temple has walls you can touch. Lindenmeier? it has grass. Most of it is protected, inaccessible. You stand there, looking at a windswept plain, and all the grandeur is underground. Yet in some ways, that makes it more haunting. A site that reshaped our understanding of ancient people, and yet remains invisible to the casual eye. And so we're left with questions. The Folsom hunters clearly weren't primitive loners. They were part of networks that stretched across impossible distances. But how those networks functioned, whether through ritual, trade, or migration, remains a blank page. And if the story of Lindenmeier is about movement, then the next puzzle is about stillness. Magic Mountain. A site in the foothills where people gathered not for trade, but perhaps for ritual, leaving behind artifacts that hint at ceremonies we can't quite decipher. If Lindenmeier shows us the highways of prehistory, Magic Mountain hints at the shrines along the way. Magic Mountain ritual use. Nestled along the foothills west of Denver lies a site with a name that already sounds like it should be a riddle. Magic Mountain. Unlike the sweeping plains of Lindenmeier or the cliff alcoves of Mesa Verde, this place feels tucked in, intimate. A hillside overlooking the confluence of streams, shaded by cottonwoods, layered in soil like a cake, where every slice reveals a different chapter of prehistory. Archaeologists began poking into it in the mid-20th century, and what they found sent ripples through the field. Magic Mountain wasn't a one-time stopover. People came back here again and again for centuries. They left behind stone tools, ceramics, food remains, hearths, and most intriguingly, objects that hint at ritual. The site became a touchstone for understanding the archaic to early ceramic transition in Colorado, a messy period when hunter-gatherers were experimenting with farming, pottery, and more complex social practices. But the deeper they dug, the more questions surfaced. The evidence points toward ritual, but never in the straightforward way archaeologists crave. Hearths, for instance, aren't just practical cooking features. They often appear clustered, layered, sometimes reused in ways that suggest symbolic burning. Stone figurines and unusual artifacts crop up in odd places, like offerings deliberately placed rather than discarded trash. A few burials have been found nearby, though fragmentary and poorly preserved, leaving only the faintest suggestion of ceremonial handling. Everything feels like half of a sentence. Enough to suggest meaning, never enough to translate it. The name Magic Mountain wasn't given because of archaeological finds. It came from local lore long before science set its sights here. But the irony is delicious. The evidence uncovered here makes it seem like people really did treat this hill as magical. Why else return to the same slope for so long? Why else leave objects in deliberate arrangements, if not to mark meaning? Yet we can't pin down what that meaning was. Fertility rituals, seasonal ceremonies tied to the planting of maize, ancestor worship? All possibilities, none conclusive. One of the enduring mysteries is how the site sits at a crossroads. Geographically, it lies between the plains and the mountains, a liminal space where different ecological zones overlap. Symbolically, that might have made it powerful. A place where worlds meet plains, bison, hunters, and mountain foragers, old traditions and new technologies. Maybe the rituals performed here weren't just spiritual, but social glue, a way to bring together groups who otherwise lived apart. Archaeologists studying the artifacts notice patterns that defy pure utility. Certain projectile points, for example, were finely made, but never show signs of use. Pottery fragments sometimes appear in odd concentrations, as if broken intentionally rather than discarded. Bones of animals appear, not just as food remains, but as curated pieces arranged, selected, out of proportion with what would have been practical meals. It all suggests performance, ritualized action, symbolic gestures, and yet, no one can agree on what the performance was for. Science, in its hunger for clarity, sometimes stumbles here. The temptation is to retrofit a neat label, a fertility shrine, a seasonal festival site, a proto-village temple. But every neat label falls apart when you test it. If it was purely ritual, why so much evidence of everyday life? If it was purely domestic, why so many hints of ceremonial use? The truth seems to lie in between. Magic Mountain wasn't either divided by, or it was both. A place where living and ritual overlapped, where the practical and the symbolic blurred. That blurring is what unsettles modern analysis. We prefer to separate categories, sacred versus secular, economic versus religious. But Magic Mountain shrugs at those binaries. Here, you cooked meals and performed rituals in the same hearth. Here, you made tools that might serve both the hunt and the ceremony. Here, you buried the dead close to where you slept, collapsing the line between ordinary and extraordinary. It's messy, and maybe that's exactly what life was like in this liminal period of Colorado prehistory. The bigger question remains, why this hill? People roamed widely during the archaic and ceramic periods. They had choices, yet they kept circling back here. Some archaeologists proposed that the landscape itself held spiritual power, perhaps tied to water sources or to the silhouette of mountains on the horizon. Others argue it was social tradition. Once a place is marked as meaningful, it gathers weight over generations, becoming the default site for ceremonies simply because it has always been so. Standing there today, you wouldn't immediately sense its significance. The hillside looks ordinary, the streams unremarkable. Yet the ground is thick with echoes of decisions, rituals, and gatherings whose logic is lost to us. The ordinariness of the landscape is precisely what makes the mystery sharp. Meaning doesn't always leave grand monuments. Sometimes it hides in dirt and broken potsherds, whispering that the ordinary was once extraordinary. Magic Mountain frustrates science because it refuses to resolve into a single narrative. Was it sacred? Was it domestic? Was it seasonal? Yes and no. It was something larger, a layered place where meanings piled on top of each other just as the soil did. Archaeologists scrape down through levels of time, but each layer only complicates the picture further. The hill resists being boxed into categories, just as it resisted being reduced to a single purpose for the people who used it. And perhaps that's the deepest mystery. Not what rituals happened here, but why we're so desperate to name them. Maybe the hill's true power was its ambiguity, its ability to serve as both hearth and altar, both gathering and ceremony, a space of overlap, liminality, transformation. That, at least, we can feel across the centuries, even if we can't articulate it. Which leads us west, deeper into the state, toward enigmas less domesticated and more wild. Colorado's remote western slope holds artifacts and features stranger still, objects found out of place, evidence that doesn't line up neatly, histories half recorded and half imagined. If Magic Mountain blurs categories, the grand archaeological enigmas of the western slope refuse categories altogether. They sit out there in the desert silence, waiting, daring us to make sense of them. Grand archaeological enigmas. The western slope of Colorado doesn't get as much attention as Mesa Verde or Denver's archaeological hotspots. It's remote, harsh, a landscape of sandstone cliffs, arid basins, and winding canyons that look like they've been carved by the careful hand of time itself. And tucked inside this dramatic backdrop are finds that don't fit anywhere neatly, artifacts and features that archaeologists catalog with caution, then often set aside because they complicate the story too much. These are the enigmas, the fragments that refuse to behave. Reports speak of odd artifacts discovered in caves, in cliffside alcoves, or eroding out of desert soil, pottery shards that don't resemble local styles, petroglyphs etched in ways that resist interpretation, their motifs overlapping with symbols from far-off cultures, even scattered structures, low walls or stone alignments whose functions are still anyone's guess. Unlike Mesa Verde, these sites don't announce themselves as villages or temples. They sit half-hidden, ambiguous, daring researchers to commit to a definition. The temptation, of course, is to reach for the exotic. Theories spring up that the western slope held contact with cultures far to the south or west, or that isolated groups were experimenting with architectural or symbolic forms unique to them. But the problem is evidence, or the lack of it. A single out-of-place artifact doesn't prove a cultural invasion. A peculiar alignment of stones doesn't guarantee a temple. And yet, when you stack enough anomalies together, the unease grows. Something was happening here, and we don't know what. Consider the reports of Mesoamerican-like motifs on certain petroglyphs, spirals, anthropomorphic figures, and stylized animals that echo imagery found hundreds of miles away. Are these coincidences parallel inventions by different peoples who saw the world in similar shapes? Or are they faint echoes of contact zones, evidence of ideas traveling across landscapes in ways we don't fully grasp? If the latter, then the western slope may have been more connected than we give it credit for, a crossroad rather than a cul-de-sac. Archaeologists tend to be cautious about these claims. Extraordinary connections require extraordinary evidence, and so far, the finds are more puzzling than definitive. But even without grand theories, the western slope still poses questions. Why do so many small sites appear here, scattered and inconsistent, with features that don't match broader Puebloan or Fremont traditions? Were these outposts of groups experimenting with different ways of life? Were they ceremonial sites used temporarily, then abandoned? Or were they simply remnants of groups whose identities were swallowed up by time, leaving only enigmatic signatures on stone? The landscape itself plays a role in the mystery. The canyons and mesas of the western slope are remote, difficult to traverse. To live here required resilience, but also creativity. Perhaps the oddities are not anomalies at all, but adaptations, styles, and practices tuned to the demands of this harsh region. What looks strange from the outside may have made perfect sense to the people who lived it. And yet, the unanswered questions linger. Many of the sites are underdocumented, neglected compared to more famous locations, which leaves the western slope as a kind of archaeological twilight zone. A place where tantalizing hints surface, but where the full story remains locked in stone and soil. It's the uncertainty that makes the region feel almost theatrical. You walk into a canyon, stumble on the wall, alignment, or a petroglyph panel, and you're forced into speculation. What was this for? Who carved this? Was this a home, a shrine, a marker, or simply the residue of something we can't categorize? No matter how you frame it, you're left with absence where there should be clarity. And that absence is the essence of mystery. But sometimes, the enigma doesn't come from the ancient past at all. Sometimes, it's a product of human imagination colliding with fraud, hoax, or myth. Which brings us to one of Colorado's most bizarre archaeological footnotes, the story of the solid Muldoon, a petrified prehistoric giant that fooled an entire region before being exposed as a hoax. Solid Muldoon. The year was 1877. Colorado was buzzing with mining booms, frontier towns, and the kind of restless curiosity that thrives in places where science and spectacle rub shoulders. Into this atmosphere walked, or rather, was dragged the solid Muldoon, supposedly discovered near Beulah. It was described as a petrified prehistoric human, a giant figure entombed in stone, complete with exaggerated features that seemed to confirm every tall tale about ancient races of titans. The newspapers went wild. Headlines trumpeted the find as proof of a prehistoric race. Crowds gathered to see it. Entrepreneurs cashed in on the spectacle, charging admission to view the ancient man. Scientists, too, were intrigued at first, though the more cautious voices urged skepticism. And of course, it turned out to be a hoax. The Muldoon was not an ancient petrified human, but a crafted statue made from a mix of materials, likely cement, clay, rock dust, and blood, to give it a more organic texture. It had been deliberately buried, then conveniently discovered. The perpetrators knew exactly what they were doing. They were selling mystery. But here's the twist. The motives weren't entirely clear. Some say it was simply a money-making scheme. Others argue it was a deliberate prank on P.T. Barnum, who had himself been accused of staging similar hoaxes like the Cardiff Giant. Whatever the case, the solid Muldoon became a cultural moment, blurring the line between archaeology and entertainment, between scientific discovery and showmanship. Why does this matter? Because it highlights something deeply human. Our hunger for mystery is so strong that we'll suspend disbelief, even when the evidence is shaky. The Muldoon wasn't just a hoax, it was a mirror. It showed how badly people wanted to believe in lost civilizations, in giants, in the extraordinary hiding just under the soil of Colorado. And in that sense, it's not so different from the real enigmas. The hoax thrived because it tapped into the same itch the genuine mysteries provoke, the sense that there's more to the land than we can explain. Even after the Muldoon was exposed, it left a residue of fascination. Some locals continued to insist it was real, or that the hoax itself concealed a deeper truth. That's the paradox of mysteries. Once introduced, they never fully vanish, even when disproven. They linger in imagination, waiting to be resurrected in retellings. And so, the solid Muldoon sits alongside Colorado's more authentic enigmas, not because it was real, but because it revealed how eager we are to find the extraordinary in the ordinary. Which makes the next puzzle all the more intriguing. A real site. Not a hoax, but one whose cultural connections remain unsettled. Cedar Point Village, a settlement of the Dismal River culture, raises questions about how these people fit into the wider Apachean story. If the Muldoon represents our manufactured mysteries, Cedar Point forces us to confront the ones we still can't untangle. Cedar Point Village culture. On the eastern plains of Colorado, far from the dramatic cliff dwellings and canyon temples, lies a quieter archaeological site with a deceptively simple appearance, Cedar Point Village. Discovered in the mid-20th century, it looked at first like just another set of earth lodges, circular depressions in the soil, remnants of houses built of wood, grass, and earth. But archaeologists quickly realized that these were not ordinary plains lodges. They belonged to the Dismal River culture, a group linked tentatively and controversially to the early Apachean peoples. This connection alone makes Cedar Point Village a mystery. The Apachean story is one of the great puzzles of North American prehistory. Where did the Apache and Navajo come from? How did their ancestors migrate from the north into the southwest? The evidence suggests they moved southward within the last 1,000 years, but the trail is fragmented. Cedar Point Village, with its earth lodges and distinctive artifacts, sits right on that hazy frontier between known history and speculation. The lodges themselves are curious, circular, semi-subterranean, framed with posts and covered with brush and earth. They resemble the dwellings of other plains groups. But the pottery at Cedar Point is different, thin-walled, often decorated with cord impressions. The arrow points are distinct as well, small and triangular, hinting at a technological style that doesn't fit neatly with neighboring cultures. It is this combination of traits that makes archaeologists whisper Dismal River. But what exactly does that mean? The Dismal River culture, identified primarily in Nebraska and Kansas, is thought to represent migrating Athabascan speakers, the ancestors of modern Apache groups moving down from the north. If that's true, then Cedar Point is evidence of their presence in Colorado, marking a waypoint in a vast and still uncertain migration, yet the connections are slippery. The pottery resembles Dismal River types, but not perfectly. The tools echo Apachean traditions, but with local twists. Was Cedar Point truly Apachean? Or was it an independent group borrowing and blending traditions? That's the enigma. Cedar Point feels both familiar and alien. It belongs to a recognized cultural horizon, and yet it doesn't quite fit. Some researchers argue it was an Apachean settlement, plain and simple. Others suggest it was a hybrid community, mixing ideas from neighbors with their own innovations. And still others propose it may have been something entirely different. A group we can't classify because their cultural fingerprint has been smudged by time. Then there is the question of purpose. Was Cedar Point a permanent village or a seasonal stopover? The lodges suggest stability, but the material remains are sparse. If it was a community, it wasn't large. Perhaps it was a small frontier settlement, a testing ground for groups exploring new territory. Or perhaps it was ceremonial, its lodges used intermittently for gatherings or rituals. The soil refuses to tell us clearly. In many ways, Cedar Point represents the limits of archaeology. You can measure post-hole patterns, analyze pottery shards, carbon date charcoal, but at the end of the day, you're left with interpretive leaps. And Cedar Point forces some of the largest leaps of all because it sits at the crossroads of migration, identity, and cultural transformation. Was it Apachean? Was it something else? The answer seems to hover just beyond our grasp, taunting us with absence. And yet, that absence matters. Cedar Point reminds us that history isn't neat. Cultures don't migrate in orderly arrows on maps. They blend, adapt, fracture, reinvent. Cedar Point is a fossil of that messiness, a reminder that even small depressions in the Colorado Plains can reshape our understanding of entire peoples. But if Cedar Point raises questions about cultural identity, the next mystery shifts the focus from who people were to how they survived and how they managed feats of coordination that seem astonishing even today. Enter the Olsen-Chubbuck site, where nearly 200 bison met their end in a prehistoric stampede, orchestrated by hunters whose methods remain as chilling as they are impressive. Olsen-Chubbuck kill method. Imagine a windswept arroyo on the eastern plains of Colorado, about 8,000 years ago. A group of hunters has gathered, dozens if not more, armed with stone-tipped spears and an intimate knowledge of the land. Ahead of them is a herd of bison, massive creatures, not the modern American bison, but their larger Pleistocene-era cousins. Somehow, the hunters managed to drive nearly 200 of these animals into the arroyo, trapping them in a mass kill that would provide food, hides, and bone for months. This is the Olsen-Chubbuck site, one of the most extraordinary bison kill sites ever discovered in North America. When excavated in the 1,950 seconds, archaeologists found the bones stacked layer upon layer, the remains of an entire herd slaughtered in a single event. The scale was staggering, almost 200 bison processed with stone tools, their carcasses dismembered and sorted with astonishing efficiency. But the real mystery isn't the aftermath, it's the method. How, without horses, fences, or firearms, did hunters drive such a massive herd into a narrow arroyo? The logistics boggle the mind. Bison are not docile creatures. They're fast, powerful, and easily spooked. To funnel them into a trap required careful planning, coordination, and timing. Some archaeologists suggest the hunters used natural features, ridges, and gullies to steer the herd, creating a living funnel that ended in the arroyo. Others argue they may have constructed temporary drives with brush or noise, using human voices and movement to guide the animals. Whatever the method, it required extraordinary cooperation. This wasn't a handful of hunters, it was a community effort, dozens working in sync like a choreographed dance of life and death. And that raises questions about social organization. What kind of society could pull this off? Coordinating a hunt of this magnitude suggests leadership, communication, and shared ritual. Perhaps the hunt itself was ceremonial, a performance as much as a practical necessity. The sheer abundance of meat produced far more than a single group could consume, hints that it wasn't just about survival. Maybe it was a seasonal event, a grand gathering where multiple bands came together, forging alliances through shared labor and feasting. But even with these theories, gaps remain. The bones tell us the kill was efficient, but not how it was accomplished. No fences survive, no traces of drive lines. The hunters left behind tools and bones, not blueprints. Modern experiments with bison herding show how difficult it is to control even a few animals, let alone hundreds. And yet, the people at Olsen-Chubbuck did it. Not once in theory, but in reality. The bones prove it. The mystery deepens when you consider the precision of the kill. Archaeologists found that the bison were dispatched and processed systematically, with young and old animals alike represented in the remains. This wasn't a chaotic stampede ending in random deaths. It was controlled, deliberate, almost industrial inefficiency. And yet, this was 8,000 years ago, long before metal tools or domesticated animals reshaped human capabilities. What drove them to attempt such a feat? Was it necessity a desperate push to secure food in lean times? Or was it ritual a demonstration of skill, a way to bind groups together through shared spectacle? The truth, as usual, is probably both. But the fact that we still ask these questions shows how remarkable the site remains. Standing at Olsen-Chubbuck today, you'd see only a dry arroyo, wind sweeping across the plains. The bones are gone, carefully excavated decades ago. But if you let your imagination stretch, you can almost hear the thunder of hooves, the shouts of hunters, the roar of a herd driven into inevitability. You can feel the tension of a mystery unsolved, not just how they did it, but what it meant to them. And from here, the trail of enigmas winds back toward the caves of Colorado, where storage pits and caches whisper of hidden uses. The next mystery takes us underground, into Mantle's cave, a place whose layers of charcoal and artifacts hint at older, deeper occupations still waiting in the dark. Mantle's cave cache origins. In the rugged sandstone of northwestern Colorado, there lies a cavern known as Mantle's Cave, a place that seems, at first, unremarkable. To stumble across it as an ordinary hiker, you might think of it as just another natural shelter, an overhang carved by erosion, a dark place to duck into when storms blow across the desert. But beneath the dust and silence lies one of the most curious archaeological stories in the state. For here, in the shadows, people stored their possessions and perhaps their secrets for centuries. When archaeologists began excavating Mantle's Cave in the 1,930 seconds and 1,940 seconds, they found evidence of caches, bundles of goods carefully placed, wrapped, and tucked away in alcoves. These weren't random discards or forgotten trash heaps. They were deliberate deposits, baskets, tools, and items that looked like they had been set aside for safekeeping. But whose possessions were these, and why were they hidden here? That's the first of many questions. The main interpretation is that Mantle's Cave was a storage facility, a communal pantry of sorts. The Fremont people, who lived across Utah and western Colorado, were known for their farming villages and seasonal mobility. It's possible that groups moving through the region used Mantle's Cave as a secure spot to stash food, tools, or supplies for later use. Think of it as the prehistoric version of a storage unit, safe, dry, out of the way. Yet the deeper archaeologists dug, the more complicated the story became. At one level of the cave, they found charcoal evidence of burning, possibly from hearths or torches. But the charcoal came from a depth that suggested much older use, far earlier than the Fremont occupation. Could it be that Mantle's Cave had been used by entirely different groups long before the Fremont arrived? If so, then the cave's history stretches back into the deep prehistory of the region, with multiple cultures layering their activities, like ghostly tenants leaving traces in the same apartment. That charcoal is the real enigma. Charcoal usually means fire, and fire usually means human presence. But no clear living structures were found at that depth. No hearths, no bedding, nothing to indicate long-term habitation. So was Mantle's Cave used for short-term shelter, ceremonial burning, or something entirely different? The ambiguity gnaws at interpretation. Then there's the matter of the caches themselves. What exactly were people storing here, and why? Some of the items suggest practical use food containers, tools for hunting and farming. Others feel less utilitarian, more symbolic, as though the act of placing them in the cave carried ritual weight. Was Mantle's Cave not just a storage locker, but a sacred vault? Did groups use it to deposit offerings, or to preserve objects tied to identity and tradition? Another layer of mystery comes from the sheer variety of objects. They represent different materials and styles, hinting at wide-ranging influences. Was Mantle's cave a waypoint in broader networks of exchange? Did it serve as a regional hub, where people passing through left behind supplies for later retrieval? That would make sense in such a rugged landscape, where mobility and planning were essential for survival. Yet, like many archaeological puzzles, the deeper you go, the less clear the picture becomes. Excavation at Mantle's cave was never exhaustive. Large portions remain unstudied, meaning that whatever secrets lie in the deeper layers are still locked away. The charcoal at depth is tantalizing, but we don't know how far back it goes. Without fuller investigation, the cave remains both a treasure chest and a sealed book. Today, Mantle's cave is quiet, its walls covered with dust and shadows. But if you look closely, you can almost see the faint outline of baskets leaning against the stone, the remnants of fires glowing in the dark. You can feel the presence of people who came here not to live, but to leave, to deposit parts of their world into the silence. And so, the cave raises a larger question. How much of Colorado's prehistory remains hidden in places like this, only partially uncovered, only partially understood? If Mantle's cave was a storage site with unexplored depth, what else lies waiting in the dark? Which leads naturally to another cavern, this one on the Front Range. Unlike Mantle's cave, it didn't just preserve tools and baskets. It preserved something rarer, almost impossible in most archaeological contexts: perishable artifacts, objects of fiber and fabric that should have long since decayed. Welcome to Franktown Cave, where moccasins, grass socks, and woven goods whisper secrets about the people who once sheltered there. Franktown Cave, perishables. If most archaeological sites are time capsules of stone and bone, Franktown Cave is a miracle. Located near the town of Franktown, southeast of Denver, the site is a rock shelter with a preservation environment so favorable that it did the impossible. It kept perishable items intact for centuries. Grass socks, moccasins, woven bags, bits of clothing. These aren't the kind of things archaeologists usually get to study, because fabric and fiber crumble long before stone does. But here, in the dry, protected shelter of Franktown Cave, they survived. The find stunned researchers. For once, they weren't just piecing together prehistoric life from projectile points and broken pots. They could actually see what people wore, what they carried, how they crafted everyday objects out of fragile materials. The moccasins, for instance, are some of the oldest ever discovered in the region, showing intricate weaving and tailoring. The grass socks, padded and practical, speak to winters that bit deep and the ingenuity required to endure them. Yet, as much as these objects reveal, they also deepen the mystery. The people who lived at Franktown Cave left behind astonishing artifacts, but little else to explain who they were or how they lived. Were they full-time residents or seasonal occupants? Did they use the cave as a base camp or as a refuge during harsher months? The evidence is tantalizing, but incomplete. Archaeologists found multiple occupation layers in the cave, suggesting it was used off and on for thousands of years. The earliest layers date back to the Archaic period, long before farming took hold in the region. Later layers include pottery fragments, showing contact with farming groups and shifting lifeways. But the continuity is patchy. Franktown Cave doesn't tell a single story, it tells fragments of many. The perishable artifacts add another layer of enigma. They suggest a people skilled in weaving, tailoring, and adapting natural materials into complex tools. But where did they learn these techniques? Were they innovating independently or borrowing from neighbors? The moccasins, for instance, resemble styles seen in both the plains and the Southwest, raising questions about cultural connections. The woven bag suggests trade or shared knowledge across regions. And then there's the matter of rarity. For every Franktown Cave, there are hundreds of sites where perishable items vanished long ago. That means our understanding of prehistoric life is skewed, tilted toward what survives in stone and bone. Franktown is a reminder of how much is missing. For every moccasin that survived here, How many thousands crumbled to dust elsewhere? For every woven bag in this cave, how many were lost forever? Franktown doesn't just expand the record, it exposes the gaps. Some archaeologists have called Franktown Cave a Rosetta Stone of Colorado prehistory, not because it translates a language, but because it hints at entire worlds of daily life that we rarely glimpse. Grass socks may sound trivial compared to monumental ruins, but they tell us about climate, resource use, craftsmanship, and the human drive to adapt. They anchor prehistory in the tangible details of survival. Yet, even here, clarity slips away. The cave was used at intervals across millennia, meaning we can't tie its artifacts to a single culture or narrative. Was it Fremont, plains, groups, early Puebloan contacts, migrants experimenting with farming? The answer shifts depending on which layer you dig into. Like Mantle's cave, Franktown refuses to be pinned down. It is not a single story, but a palimpsest of many. Today, Franktown Cave remains one of Colorado's most important archaeological sites, but it is still underanalyzed. Reports remain incomplete, early excavations left gaps, and questions continue to pile up. We marvel at the socks and shoes, but we still don't know the people who wore them. Their names, their stories, their languages, all vanished, leaving only fragile threads to taunt us. And perhaps that is the final irony. The perishable survived, while the permanent, the identities and voices perished. Franktown Cave gives us shoes without the footprints, clothes without the wearers. It is a mystery stitched in fiber, unraveling as fast as we study it. From here, the enigma shifts from artifacts to language itself, because the next puzzle isn't about caves, storage, or clothing. It's about names, specifically, what the ancestral Puebloans once called themselves. For centuries, we've used the word Anastasi, but even that name is borrowed, perhaps misleading, and the true self-identity of these people remains an unsolved riddle. Anastasi, ancestral Pueblo, name origins. Few mysteries are as deceptively simple as a name. For decades, school children and tourists were told about the Anastasi, the cliff-dwelling, ancient ones who left behind Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon. The word itself carries a sense of mystery, as though it belonged to some lost tongue whispering across canyons. But the truth is both stranger and more unsettling. The people we call Anastasi never called themselves that. Anastasi comes from the Navajo language. Roughly translated, it means something like ancient enemies or ancestors of our enemies. Already you can feel the problem. Imagine your descendants being remembered not by the name you gave yourself, but by a label applied by outsiders, one that framed you in terms of conflict. It is, at best, an accident of history. At worst, it's a distortion that's shaped how generations have thought about an entire civilization. The descendants of the cliff dwellers, the modern Pueblo peoples such as the Hopi, Zuni, and others along the Rio Grande don't use Anastasi. They prefer ancestral Puebloans, a term that feels more neutral, less burdened with the shadows of warfare. Yet even ancestral Puebloans is an archaeological convenience, not a true name. It describes a relationship we see from the outside, not the identity that people gave themselves. Their true name, whatever they called themselves in their own language, has been lost. Why? Part of the answer lies in the brutal disruptions of history. When the Pueblo peoples migrated out of Mesa Verde and other centers in the 13th century, their languages and identities shifted. Oral traditions survived, but they don't preserve a neat label like a dictionary entry. The Spanish colonization that followed only deepened the erasure, layering new names and categories over old ones. By the time archaeology began in earnest, the self-designation of the cliff dwellers was already buried under centuries of translation and misinterpretation. But another part of the answer lies in our own hunger for labels. Archaeologists love names Folsom, Clovis, Fremont, Dismal River, because they help categorize. Yet those names often come from places, discoverers, or neighboring groups, not the people themselves. Anastasi stuck because it sounded exotic, because it packaged mystery into a single word. It became branding. Tourists visiting Mesa Verde could buy postcards stamped with Land of the Anastasi. Museums filled shelves with Anastasi pottery and Anastasi culture. The word became a product, detached from the people it supposedly described. The irony is sharp. A culture that left behind some of the most extraordinary architecture in North America, that tracked the heavens and engineered cliff palaces, is remembered not by its chosen identity, but by a label meaning enemy. It's a historical sleight of hand, a reminder of how the stories we tell about the past are shaped not only by evidence, but by language, and by who controls that language. Scientists and descendants alike wrestle with this erasure. Scholars dig through linguistic evidence, hoping to catch a glimmer of self-identity. Pueblo elders tell oral histories that root the cliff dwellers firmly as their ancestors, even if the ancient name has faded. But the truth remains elusive. The label Ancestral Puebloans is a respectful placeholder, a correction against Anastasi, but it is still just that, a placeholder. The real name is gone, dissolved in centuries of migration, colonization, and silence. And so, the mystery of the Anastasi name is not just a matter of semantics, it's about identity, about how cultures are remembered or misremembered across time. What does it mean that one of the most iconic civilizations of North America is known to us through borrowed words? What other distortions hide in plain sight, embedded in the very terms we use? From here, the mystery turns geological. If names vanish, so too can entire stretches of Earth's history. And nowhere is that clearer than in the Great Unconformity, where 500 million years of rock record have simply disappeared, leaving a blank in the timeline of Colorado's past. Great Unconformity. Travel to Garden of the Gods, near Colorado Springs, and you'll find yourself staring at cliffs where crimson sandstone tilts skyward in dramatic slabs. Tourists gawk at the formations, snapping pictures of balanced rock or the cathedral-like fins of stone. But geologists see something even stranger. A massive gap in time. A discontinuity in the layers of rock so profound that it has its own name, the Great Unconformity. Here's what it means. Between the basement granite and the younger sandstone, there is a missing record of nearly 500 million years. 500 million years simply gone. No fossils, no sediment. No trace of what happened in that immense span of Earth's history. You run your hand along the cliff face and, without realizing it, you're moving across a time jump larger than the history of multicellular life itself. Geologists have been puzzling over this for generations. The question is simple but maddening. What happened to those missing layers? The prevailing theories revolve around erosion on a planetary scale. Perhaps the ancient continent was uplifted and stripped bare by wind and water, removing hundreds of millions of years' worth of rock before the younger sandstone was laid down. Others suggest tectonic upheaval or even glacial activity that scoured the land clean. But none of these theories feel entirely satisfying. Erosion is convenient, but it raises its own questions. How could erosion strip away so much across such a wide area and leave so little trace? Why here, in Colorado, and across other parts of the continent, do we find such gaping voids in the rock record? It feels less like normal geology and more like someone tore a chapter out of Earth's diary. The scale of the mystery becomes clear when you realize what's missing. The unconformity erases the transition from the deep Precambrian to the Cambrian explosion, the very moment when complex life burst onto the scene. In other words, the rocks beneath our feet skip over the most important evolutionary leap in history. If you wanted to find a smoking gun for life's origins, you'd expect it here. Instead, you get silence. Scientists continue to study the gap with increasingly sophisticated tools. They analyze zircon crystals for geochemical signatures, map fault lines, and model tectonic processes. Some suggest that the missing record may be tied to the assembly and breakup of ancient supercontinents. Others tie it to deep global glaciations, the snowball Earth hypothesis that may have scraped the continents bare. But despite decades of study, no consensus has emerged. The great unconformity remains exactly what its name implies, a refusal of the Earth to conform to neat storytelling. For the public, the mystery is less about the mechanisms and more about the sheer audacity of the gap, 500 million years. To put that in perspective, if human history were a single day, the unconformity would be like losing the entire morning and part of the afternoon, leaving only a few evening hours to study. What kind of story can you tell with that much missing? Standing at Garden of the Gods, looking at the sharp line between granite and sandstone, you feel the vertigo of absence, not just deep time, but missing time. It is the geological equivalent of a black hole, an absence so massive it bends our understanding around it. And if the great unconformity leaves us grasping for explanations, the next theory raises the stakes even higher. Some researchers argue that the very formation of the Colorado Plateau itself, the grand stage on which all these mysteries play out, may have been triggered not by gradual erosion or uplift, but by something cataclysmic, a Mars-sized impact that reshaped the land in an instant. Colorado Plateau Impact Hypothesis. The Colorado Plateau sprawls across 4 states, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, like an enormous stage set for geological theater. Its mesas, canyons, and arches look eternal, sculpted by time into something both desolate and divine. To most geologists, the plateau is an anomaly, a block of crust that seems to have risen as one, barely deformed, while the world around it buckled and crumpled. That strange stability is the seed of the Colorado Plateau Impact Hypothesis, one of the boldest and most controversial theories in American geology. The idea is radical. Sometime in Earth's deep past, a Mars-sized object slammed into the planet, and the aftermath sculpted what we now call the Colorado Plateau. Not a meteor, not a small asteroid, but a planetary-scale collision, an impact with enough force to crack continents and rewrite landscapes on a continental scale. The appeal of the theory is obvious. The plateau is geologically weird. Unlike surrounding regions that show folding, faulting, and chaos, the plateau is a relatively intact block, lifted thousands of feet but without the same degree of structural damage. To explain that, some geologists turn to impact. Maybe the plateau is the scar of unimaginable violence, the result of a cosmic accident written in stone. Supporters point to oddities, the sharp uplift, the uniformity of the block, the absence of typical tectonic deformation. They argue that an impact could have fractured the crust and then caused rebound uplift, explaining the plateau's strange preservation. Some even claim that shock metamorphism, microscopic deformation in minerals could be evidence of an ancient collision. But skeptics push back. A Mars-sized impact isn't a small claim. It requires extraordinary evidence. Shatter cones, shocked quartz, impact craters, ejecta layers. And so far, the smoking gun hasn't been found. Much of the argument rests on circumstantial evidence and large-scale pattern recognition. Critics say the plateau can be explained by more mundane processes, tectonic uplift, buoyant mantle activity, or the slow stretching and rifting of the crust. No need to invoke cosmic catastrophe when geology itself provides plenty of tools. Still, the impact hypothesis refuses to die. It lingers at the edges of respectability, too extraordinary to dismiss outright, too speculative to accept. And perhaps that's what makes it so haunting. Because if it were true, it would reframe everything. The very stage of Colorado's human and geological mysteries, Mesa Verde, Canyonlands, the Grand Canyon, would itself be the child of catastrophe, a monument not to erosion alone but to violence from the heavens. Think of the irony. People building temples to the sun and tracking lunar standstills on land that itself might have been sculpted by an ancient cosmic strike. Cultures chasing meaning in the sky, not knowing that the ground beneath them may have been rewritten by it long before they arrived. For now, the hypothesis remains unresolved, hanging between possibility and dismissal, Some geologists embrace its drama, others roll their eyes. But either way, the Colorado Plateau continues to sit in silence, a block of stone that looks too stable to be natural, too strange to be explained without mystery. And from geology, the story pivots back to people, this time through their art. Carved into canyon walls and boulders across Colorado are petroglyphs whose spirals, figures, and animals speak of visions we still don't understand. If the plateau might be the scar of an impact, then the rock art upon it is a different kind of scar, the trace of minds reaching for something beyond explanation. Pueblo rock art origins. Across the sandstone cliffs of southern Colorado, the walls bear messages no one can fully read. Petroglyphs pecked into stone, their grooves smoothed by centuries of wind, depict spirals, human-like forms, shamanic figures, and animals caught mid-motion. Dating as far back as the basket maker era, around the 3rd century AD, these carvings represent one of the most enduring mysteries of the Pueblo world, the meaning of their rock art. At first glance, it's tempting to treat petroglyphs as simple storytelling. A hunter scratches an image of a deer because he hunted a deer. A spiral represents the Sunday. A handprint is just a handprint. But the deeper you look, the less simple it becomes. Spirals, for example, are everywhere in Puebloan art. They may represent the sun, or migration, or portals into other worlds. They may have been tied to ceremonies marking solstices or to visions experienced in trance states. The same shape could mean 10 different things, or all of them at once. And that's the heart of the mystery. The petroglyphs don't come with captions. We can carbon date the rock varnish, we can map the panels, but we can't translate them with certainty. These were not alphabets or casual graffiti. They were symbolic systems rooted in cosmology, spirituality, and social memory. To the people who carved them, their meanings were obvious. To us, they're riddles etched into stone. Some researchers suggest the art reflects shamanic visions, figures with elongated limbs, animal-human hybrids, and swirling lines resemble imagery produced in altered states of consciousness. If true, then the panels are not just records of daily life, but windows into ceremonial experiences, spiritual journeys captured in stone. Others argue for more practical interpretations: migration records, territorial markers, star charts. The problem is that both possibilities can fit, and the evidence refuses to narrow. Then there's the issue of continuity. Modern Pueblo peoples, such as the Hopi and Zuni, maintain oral traditions that link them to the basket maker and ancestral Puebloan past. Some rock art motifs appear in their ceremonial symbolism even today, suggesting deep cultural continuity. Yet when elders are asked directly about certain symbols, the answers are often guarded or absent. Some meanings may be too sacred to share. Others may have been lost entirely. The rock holds memory, but memory erodes. For archaeologists, the frustration is palpable. Petroglyphs are abundant in Colorado, from canyon walls to remote outcrops. They're striking, evocative, undeniably important. But their very abundance makes them slippery. If everything is symbolic, how do you tell which symbols mattered most? If spirals appear everywhere, does that mean they were universal, or that they were locally interpreted in countless ways? And yet, this very ambiguity is what gives the rock art its power. Standing in front of a panel in a canyon, you feel the pull of something unresolved. The figures are silent but insistent, as though they're daring you to guess. A spiral could be a sun, or a journey, or a door into another reality. The uncertainty is part of the experience. It forces you to reckon with the limits of interpretation. Perhaps the deepest irony is that the rock art may never have been meant for outsiders at all. It could have been coded, restricted, meaningful only to those initiated into its secrets. If so, then our confusion isn't a failure of science, but the result of deliberate secrecy. The stone remembers, but it does not tell. And so, the Pueblo petroglyphs remain a visual enigma, artifacts of vision and ceremony carved into cliffs that still echo with wind and silence. If they were maps, we can't follow them. If they were prayers, we can't recite them. They sit halfway between message and mystery. Which brings us to another tantalizing story from Colorado's western slope, a tale of explorers, archaeologists, and speculation about a lost Spanish prehistoric civilization. A civilization that may never have existed, but that still haunts the imagination with whispers of ruins hidden in the desert canyons. Lost Spanish prehistoric civilization. If Colorado's western slope is already a theater of enigmas, then the whispers of a lost Spanish prehistoric civilization are its most theatrical act. The story begins with explorers and amateur archaeologists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, wandering through rugged canyons and mesas north of Colbran. They claimed to find ruins, stone walls, artifacts, fragments of a culture that didn't fit neatly into the Puebloan or Fremont frameworks. And soon, speculation bloomed. Could an entire civilization have thrived here, one that history had erased? The more extravagant versions of the story leaned toward romance and conspiracy. Some insisted these ruins were not native at all, but traces of an ancient Spanish presence centuries older than Coronado or the conquistadors, predating the documented arrival of Europeans in the Southwest. The suggestion was tantalizing: hidden colonies, pre-Columbian settlements of outsiders who left no written record but somehow shaped the land. Mainstream archaeologists, predictably, are skeptical. They point out that many of the ruins were misinterpreted natural features, or ordinary Fremont and Ute sites recast through the lens of myth-making. Yet the legend persists, fueled by scattered anomalies, odd artifacts, unusual building patterns, reports of inscriptions that defy easy translation. These scraps are rarely conclusive, but they keep the mystery alive. What makes the idea of a lost civilization so sticky? Partly, it's human nature. We love stories of forgotten empires, buried under dust, waiting to be rediscovered. Atlantis, El Dorado, the city of gold Colorado's western slope, provides its own version of that fantasy. The isolation of the region only adds fuel. In landscapes so vast and uncharted, it feels plausible that something could hide out there, unseen. But there's another layer, too. The speculation about a lost Spanish civilization reveals as much about the people telling the story as it does about the land itself. Early Euro-American settlers in Colorado were eager to anchor themselves to a grand past, one that connected them, however dubiously, to civilizations they deemed more noble or advanced. To claim Spanish ruins was to claim legitimacy, to suggest that Colorado was not wilderness but a stage for high history. The irony, of course, is that the real histories, the Fremont, the Ute, the Puebloan migrations, were already profound and complex, but those stories were too often ignored in favor of imported legends. The lost Spanish civilization was a way of erasing indigenous presence while pretending to honor mystery. Still, the legend lingers, particularly in local lore. Even today, hikers and amateur sleuths report odd stone alignments or weathered inscriptions, convinced they've stumbled on traces of the forgotten. Archaeologists rarely confirm these finds, but they rarely extinguish them either. Mystery has momentum, and once people believe a hidden civilization waits to be found, every rock outcrop becomes a clue. What's left, then, is ambiguity, a mix of real archaeology, misinterpretation, and imagination. Whether or not a Spanish prehistoric civilization ever existed, the legend says something about how we project meaning onto ruins. It shows how desperate we are to find echoes of ourselves in the past, even if we have to invent them. And perhaps that's why the story doesn't fade. Because, in the end, it isn't just about Colorado, it's about the human need to populate the unknown with tales. The western slope becomes a mirror, reflecting both genuine mystery and our relentless urge to embroider it with fantasy. But while the Spanish civilization may be legend, Colorado recently produced a mystery that was anything but imaginary. In 2024, a mirrored monolith appeared near Bellevue, Colorado, without explanation or origin. Unlike lost civilizations, This one was no rumor. It was photographed, touched, and then vanished, leaving behind more questions than answers. Monolith phenomenon. Late in 2024, hikers in northern Colorado stumbled on something that looked like a science fiction prop. Rising from the ground near Bellevue was a mirrored monolith, tall, sleek, reflective, as if it had been dropped from orbit or carried in by hands that wanted to remain anonymous. It stood gleaming against the backdrop of the foothills, a stark, artificial presence in a landscape otherwise shaped by stone and pine. The images spread fast. Social media exploded with comparisons to Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey, with jokes about alien architects, with speculation that Colorado had become the latest stage for a global performance art phenomenon. Because this wasn't the first. Similar monoliths had already popped up in Utah, California, and as far away as Romania. Each appeared suddenly, without explanation, and each was quickly removed by weather, by vandals, or by their creators melting back into the shadows. So what was the Colorado monolith? A prank? A piece of guerrilla art? A viral marketing campaign? No one claimed responsibility. Local officials inspected it, scratched their heads, and eventually removed it. But the mystery remained. If it was art, what was the message? If it was a prank, why repeat it in so many far-flung places? And if it was something more, well, the speculation practically wrote itself. Scientists, of course, dismissed the extraterrestrial angle. There was no advanced technology in the monolith. It was simply mirrored panels, bolted together, firmly planted in the ground. But the artistry was undeniable. Its placement, its silence, its suddenness, all were calculated for maximum effect. You didn't need aliens for it to feel otherworldly. The power came from the disruption of context, a sleek, flawless object in the middle of rugged wilderness. The Colorado monolith joins a lineage of deliberate enigmas, objects planted not to solve mysteries, but to create them. In this sense, it isn't so different from hoaxes like the solid Muldoon, except that this time the deception was elegant rather than clumsy. No one tried to pass it off as science. It was simply there, letting mystery do the work. But why Colorado? Perhaps because the state already brims with unanswered questions. Mesa Verde collapses, cliff temples aligned to stars, caves filled with forgotten caches. The monolith fit right into the landscape's tradition of puzzles. It amplified the uncanny resonance of the land itself, as though saying, yes, mystery belongs here. What makes the monolith haunting is its intentional ephemerality. Unlike Mesa Verde, it wasn't built to last. It was erected, it drew attention, and then it was gone. Its very absence now is part of its meaning. It reminds us how fragile mystery can be, and how powerful when it appears without warning. And yet, even stripped of permanence, the Bellevue monolith lingers in the imagination. Like the petroglyphs, like the cave caches, like the missing years of the great unconformity, it refuses explanation. That's its purpose, not to answer, but to leave us unsettled. From here, the mystery shifts once more, not to mirrors or legends, but to echoes of influence. On Colorado's western slope, some archaeologists argue they see faint traces of Mesoamerican legacies, hints of cultural contact stretching across improbable distances. Whether real or imagined, these claims force us to ask, how far did ideas travel, and how much of Colorado's prehistory was shaped by worlds far to the south? Mesoamerican legacies. The western slope of Colorado does not scream Mesoamerica. It is dry, rugged, and far removed from the lush jungles of the Maya or the monumental cities of the Aztec. And yet, whispers persist, suggestions that cultural threads from far to the south might have reached these canyons, faint but visible in artifacts, art, and ritual patterns. Archaeologists call them Mesoamerican legacies, but the phrase itself is more of an admission of uncertainty than a conclusion. Some of the evidence comes from motifs in rock art. Certain symbols, serpentine shapes, geometric designs, figures with elaborate headdresses echo imagery found in Mesoamerican contexts. Are these coincidences, products of universal human imagination? Or are they faint echoes of influence carried north through trade, migration, or ritual exchange? The debate is endless. Then there are the artifacts. Turquoise, for example, was a prized material in Mesoamerica, traded over vast distances. Mines in the American Southwest provided some of that turquoise, which made its way south into Aztec and Mixtec hands. Could the flow have gone both ways? If turquoise traveled south, perhaps ideas traveled north. A ritual practice here, a symbolic motif there, drifting slowly across landscapes until they took root in Colorado's soil. Skeptics point out that influence is notoriously hard to prove. Similar shapes in rock art do not necessarily equal contact. Parallel invention, different cultures independently arriving at similar ideas is always a possibility. Yet, the persistence of the question suggests that something nags at the evidence. It doesn't feel entirely isolated. The geography complicates things further. The Colorado Plateau and Western Slope are not easily accessible, but they are not impenetrable either. River corridors, trade routes, and seasonal migrations could have linked distant groups. We know the Pueblo world engaged in wide-ranging exchange, and we know Mesoamerica was a hub of influence stretching far beyond its borders. So why not Colorado? Why not faint ripples reaching even here? Of course, the more speculative versions of the theory push too far. Some enthusiasts leap from faint similarities to grand claims of lost colonies or direct migrations of Mesoamerican peoples into Colorado. There is no credible evidence for that. But between the extremes of denial and exaggeration lies the gray zone where mystery thrives, the possibility that fragments of influence did cross the vast distance, leaving subtle fingerprints that we still struggle to recognize. And what makes this mystery so compelling is not just what it might say about Colorado, but what it might say about human connectivity. If ideas could travel hundreds of miles across deserts, mountains, and cultural boundaries, then the prehistoric world was more interwoven than we tend to assume. The people carving symbols into Colorado's stone walls were not cut off. They were part of a continental dialogue, even if only in whispers. Today, standing among the petroglyphs and ruins of the Western Slope, you can feel the weight of this uncertainty. Did these people look south and imagine distant civilizations? Did they see themselves as part of a broader web of meaning? Or are we the ones projecting connections, desperate to stitch the fragments together into a larger pattern? The answers remain elusive. The legacies, if they exist, are faint, like shadows cast across centuries. But that faintness is precisely what makes them haunting. They suggest a prehistory more complex than tidy maps of isolated cultures, a prehistory where even Colorado's remote corners were touched by distant worlds. From whispers of influence, we turn now to a more modern mystery, one that is no less haunting. In 2013, a hiker named Dale Stelling vanished near Mesa Verde. His remains were found years later under circumstances that left investigators puzzled. Unlike ancient enigmas, this is a mystery that unfolded in living memory, reminding us that disappearance and silence are not just relics of the past. Dale Stelling, disappearance. On the 9th of June 2013, 51-year-old Dale Stelling set out for a short hike near Mesa Verde National Park. He told his wife he would walk only briefly, just a stretch of the legs near the Petroglyph Point Trail. He carried no backpack, no water, just the casual gear of a man expecting to return within an hour. And then he vanished. Search crews scoured the park. Rangers, volunteers, dogs, helicopters. The full apparatus of modern search and rescue was deployed. But the canyons and mesas of Mesa Verde are deceptive. Trails snake between alcoves and cliffs, with hidden drop-offs and dense brush. For days, teams combed the terrain, finding nothing. Weeks passed, then months, then years. Stelling's disappearance faded from the headlines, another unsolved case in the catalog of missing hikers. And then, in 2020, 7 years later, a grim discovery. Skeletal remains found in a rugged area off-trail, identified as Stelling's. The location was not far from where he was last seen, but hidden enough that searchers had missed it. The discovery brought closure, but not clarity. How did he end up there? What happened in those final hours? Theories abound, but none settle comfortably. The simplest explanation is that Stelling became disoriented, wandered off trail, and succumbed to the elements. Mesa Verde's terrain can be unforgiving, even for short hikes. A slip, a twisted ankle, dehydration in the summer heat, any of these could have turned a brief excursion into tragedy, yet questions linger. Why was his body so difficult to find, despite extensive searches? Was he concealed by terrain, or did searchers somehow miss obvious signs? Others point to the uncanny nature of disappearances in wilderness areas. Colorado has its share of cases where people vanish under circumstances that seem disproportionate to the environment. Some chalk it up to bad luck and rugged terrain. Others frame it as part of a larger pattern of mystery, where the land itself seems to swallow people whole. In Stelling's case, the lack of details gnaws at the imagination. He wasn't far from civilization. He wasn't attempting a dangerous climb. He simply walked onto a trail and never returned. That ordinariness makes it unsettling. If such a thing can happen on a routine hike, what does that say about our fragile control over the wilderness? For scientists and investigators, the frustration is practical. There's no evidence of foul play, no clear signs of accident, just absence, then belated discovery. The official record may lean toward natural causes, but the silence in between the 7 years of uncertainty cannot be explained away. And perhaps that's the true heart of the mystery. Not just what happened, but how easily a human life can vanish into landscape. Mesa Verde has witnessed centuries of abandonment, migration, collapse. Dale Stelling's disappearance becomes another chapter in that story, a modern echo of the ancient silences that haunt the cliffs. For visitors walking the same trails today, his story lingers. The petroglyphs carved into stone whisper across centuries, but so too does the recent reminder that even in the age of GPS and helicopters, the land does not yield all its secrets. Some vanishings remain just that, vanishings. And so, from a modern disappearance, we turn back to prehistory. Because while Stelling's case highlights the mystery of individuals, the question of how entire cultures evolved remains equally elusive. The Pueblo cultural evolution, stretching back 3 millennia, is a story we're still struggling to piece together, a saga of growth, change, and unanswered questions etched not into headlines, but into ruins and shards of pottery. Pueblo cultural evolution. The Pueblo world stretches across centuries, a long thread of continuity woven from stone, corn, ritual, and silence. In Colorado, traces of that thread surface everywhere, from the early pit houses of the basket maker era to the monumental cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde. Yet for all the pottery shards, kivas, and corn cobs, the story of Pueblo cultural evolution remains stubbornly unclear. We can chart outlines, we can name stages, but the inner logic, the social systems, the spiritual currents, the reasons behind their transformations still elude us. Archaeologists divide the Pueblo past into tidy categories: Basket Maker 2, Basket Maker 3, Pueblo First, the Three. The terms sound orderly, like neat chapters in a book, but when you step into the soil, the order dissolves. Some groups adopted farming early, others late. Some built stone pueblos, others clung to pit houses. Corn appears, disappears, reappears. Pottery styles shift like dialects. What looks like linear evolution on a chart feels, in reality, like a web of experiments, adaptations, and reversals. At its core, Pueblo culture revolved around maize. Corn was more than food. It was identity, ceremony, lifeline. Yet the mystery lies in how it reshaped society. Did the adoption of maize trigger hierarchy, or did hierarchy foster maize adoption? Did kivas emerge as communal responses to farming stress, or as spiritual hubs that preceded agriculture. Every excavation seems to deepen the chicken and egg dilemma. And then there's the matter of collapse and migration. Around 1300 CE, the great villages of the Four Corners, including Mesa Verde, emptied. But Pueblo culture didn't vanish. It transformed. People moved south to the Rio Grande, west to the Hopi Mesas, east to scattered pueblos in New Mexico. The continuity is undeniable. You can trace pottery styles, oral traditions, architectural echoes. But the discontinuity is just as sharp. Social systems changed, rituals evolved, new forms emerged. Pueblo culture is not a straight line but a branching tree with missing limbs and unmarked grafts. Scientists attempt to resolve these puzzles with data. Dendrochronology for climate, isotopic analysis for diet, stratigraphy for chronology. Yet data alone can't decode social meaning. We know when droughts struck, but not how leaders responded. We know when populations clustered, but not whether it was out of fear, faith, or ambition. The evolution of Pueblo culture remains a mystery because it was lived in hearts and ceremonies, not just in walls and cornfields. And perhaps that's the lesson. The Pueblo story resists reduction. It was never a linear march from simple to complex, from forager to farmer. It was a dynamic dance, a constant renegotiation of survival, belief, and identity. We see the footprints, but not the choreography. From this sweeping cultural riddle, we shift to something more specific yet equally perplexing. In Colorado's high country, at altitudes where air thins and winters bite, lies evidence of game drives built by the Mount Albion complex. Stone alignments, carefully placed, channeled animals into traps. The sophistication of these drives raises questions about how prehistoric hunters planned, organized, and executed their hunts in such unforgiving terrain. Mount Albion complex game drives. High above timberline, where the peaks of Colorado stretch into alpine tundra, the wind whistles through landscapes that feel almost unlivable. And yet, scattered across these heights are stone alignments, lines of rock painstakingly arranged to guide game animals into narrow kill zones. These are the game drives of the Mount Albion complex, built nearly 4,000 years ago. Their very existence is startling. To build them required forethought, coordination, and intimate knowledge of animal behavior. To use them successfully required patience, strategy, and community. The game drives consist of low rock walls, sometimes stretching for hundreds of feet. Alone, each wall would do little. But in sequence, they form funnels, corridors that gradually narrow, steering animals toward an ambush point or corral. From the air, they resemble vast nets woven of stone. On the ground, they blend into the tundra, hidden until you stumble directly into them. What makes them mysterious is not just their sophistication, but their setting. Why build such elaborate structures at such high elevations? The tundra is harsh, with short summers and brutal winters. Yet, in those brief, warm months, herds of bighorn sheep and elk migrate into the alpine meadows. For hunters, these were opportunities too valuable to waste. The drives allowed entire herds to be trapped at once, ensuring massive returns of meat, hides, and bone. But how did small groups of prehistoric people organize such efforts? To construct drives required labor over years, perhaps decades. To operate them required dozens of hunters coordinating movement, timing, and ambush. This implies a level of social organization more complex than we usually ascribe to archaic peoples. Was there leadership? Ritual preparation? Did the hunts double as communal gatherings, with feasts and ceremonies binding groups together? The evidence hints at ritual significance. Some drive sites contain cairns, stone piles, that may have served as spiritual markers or decoys to guide animals. Others show signs of repeated use across generations, suggesting they weren't just opportunistic but embedded in cultural tradition. Perhaps the drives were not only about food, but about identity, ceremony, even cosmology. And yet, practical questions remain. How exactly did hunters maneuver animals into the drives? Did they use noise, waving hides, or coordinated lines of people? Did they wait silently as herds naturally funneled through? The bones left behind tell us that animals died here, but not the choreography of the kill. Modern experiments with herding suggest it would be extraordinarily difficult to control wild game with such precision. The Mount Albion hunters clearly succeeded, but the how remains elusive. Archaeologists map the drives, catalog their stones, and model their functions. Still, the enigma endures. These are not random piles of rock. They are purpose-built systems. But the details of their use, the ceremonies that may have accompanied them, and the social structures that supported them have all eroded into silence. Standing in the alpine tundra today, amid thin air and relentless wind, the game drives are eerie. They whisper of hunters who knew these mountains intimately, who could turn the land itself into a tool. They are reminders that sophistication is not measured by monuments alone. Sometimes it is measured by stones barely a foot high, stretching across tundra like ghostly fingerprints. And from these high-altitude hunts, the mystery shifts back to the plains. If the Mount Albion complex shows us coordination in hunting, then the Folsom tool trade networks show us coordination in exchange. Across vast distances, people moved exotic materials, linking Colorado to a continental web of trade whose roots and structures remain more theory than certainty. Folsom tool trade networks. The Folsom people have always fascinated archaeologists. Known for their finely fluted projectile points, razor-sharp, symmetrical, and technologically advanced, they flourished around 12,000 years ago, at the twilight of the Ice Age. Their tools have been found across the Great Plains, from Texas to Colorado to the Dakotas. The mystery isn't that the tools exist. The mystery is that the raw materials used to make them came from sources hundreds of miles apart. Somehow, the Folsom people were plugged into a trade network that spanned entire regions, yet we still don't know exactly how it worked. Colorado provides some of the most telling clues. At sites like Lindenmeier, archaeologists discovered Folsom points made from stone types not native to the immediate area. Chert from the Texas Panhandle, obsidian from the Rockies, even exotic materials from as far north as Wyoming all showing up in the same assemblages. This suggests either extensive mobility, where groups traveled enormous distances themselves, or a web of exchange, where goods passed from hand to hand across vast landscapes. But here's the puzzle. What exactly was being traded, and how formalized were these networks? The Folsom people were mobile hunter-gatherers, following herds of bison across plains and valleys. That lifestyle doesn't lend itself to fixed marketplaces or permanent trade hubs. Yet, the distribution of materials suggests some level of regularity, some system that kept exotic stones moving across hundreds of miles. Was it direct trade between groups meeting at seasonal gatherings? Or indirect exchange, where a piece of stone might travel in stages, carried from one band to the next until it ended up far from its source? The problem is that stone doesn't talk. You can analyze its chemistry, trace it back to a quarry, but you can't reconstruct the conversations that moved it. Maybe it was purely practical hunters sharing materials to maintain tool supplies, but maybe it was more symbolic. Certain stones may have carried meaning beyond utility. Obsidian, with its glassy sheen, might have been prized as a status item. Chert from distant quarries could have served as proof of connection, a prehistoric passport showing ties to far-off groups. And what about the tools themselves? Folsom points weren't just functional, they were masterpieces of craftsmanship, requiring skill, patience, and risk. A single mistake in fluting could shatter a point. That kind of precision hints at specialized knowledge, possibly even teaching or apprenticeship. If so, then the spread of Folsom tools across the continent wasn't just about stone, it was about the transmission of ideas, of shared technique and identity. The trade networks may have been as much intellectual as material. Archaeologists try to model these networks with maps and arrows, tracing plausible routes across river valleys and plains. But every model is speculative because the evidence is fragmented. We know the tools moved. We don't know the hands that carried them. And this is where the mystery deepens. The Folsom culture eventually gave way to later traditions, but the networks they hinted at remain obscure. Did they dissolve with environmental changes? Did they evolve into new systems we simply can't see? The story of Folsom trade is less about what we know than about what we've lost, the intangible web of relationships that connected people across landscapes. Standing at a site like Lindenmeier, you hold a fluted point in your hand and realize it carries more than craftsmanship. It carries distance. It carries the silent memory of a journey, a link to quarries hundreds of miles away. It whispers of roads that were never paved, markets that left no ruins, connections that survive only in stone. From these invisible networks, the narrative turns back underground to Mantle's cave again. For if trade and exchange highlight what moved across landscapes, the unopened deeper layers of Mantle's cave highlight what remains hidden beneath them, charcoal and sediment that may conceal an even older story we've barely begun to uncover. Unopened deeper layers at Mantle's cave. Mantle's cave has already yielded puzzles, caches of Fremont artifacts, layers of charcoal, hints of storage, and ceremonial use. But what unsettles archaeologists most isn't what has been excavated, it's what hasn't. Beneath the explored layers lie deeper strata, untouched, sealed away. And in those layers, tantalizing hints suggest an occupation older than anything yet studied. During early excavations, teams noted charcoal emerging from depths that didn't match the Fremont horizon. The material was older, potentially thousands of years older, yet no systematic effort was made to pursue it. Funding dried up, priorities shifted, and Mantle's cave was left partially unexplored. In other words, its deepest history is still in the dark, literally. That charcoal is key. Fire means people. If there are older fire remains in the cave, then Mantle's history stretches far back into the Archaic or even Paleo-Indian eras. Imagine hunters taking shelter here 6,000 years ago, long before Fremont farmers cached their baskets. Imagine the cave as a continuous thread of human use, each generation layering its traces on top of the last. Right now, that story lies unexcavated, waiting for someone brave enough to peel back the sediment. The mystery isn't just academic. Deeper layers could change the way we understand the chronology of human presence in northwestern Colorado. They could connect Mantle's cave to broader patterns of mobility, ritual, and storage that span millennia. Or they could reveal something entirely unexpected, a use of the cave that doesn't fit Fremont traditions or later expectations. But for now, it's all speculation. Without excavation, we can only wonder. And this is where archaeology collides with reality: funding, logistics, preservation. To dig deeper means risking what's already there. Sometimes leaving a site unexcavated is the only way to preserve it for future methods and technologies. But in the meantime, the unanswered questions gnaw at the imagination. What if deeper levels hold tools from a culture we haven't yet identified? What if the cave reveals continuous occupation across thousands of years, a rare, unbroken record of human adaptation to Colorado's harsh landscapes? Or just as haunting, what if the deepest layers show something inexplicable, something that doesn't match any known cultural pattern? Right now, Mantle's cave sits in uneasy limbo. We know enough to be intrigued, not enough to understand. We know there is more, but we don't know what that more island. And so the cave becomes a metaphor for archaeology itself. Layers of knowledge, some uncovered, some hidden, each excavation revealing answers but also multiplying questions. Standing at the mouth of Mantle's cave, you can feel the weight of what lies beneath. Every gust of wind seems to carry the question, what are we missing? What histories remain sealed in darkness, waiting for hands that may never come? And from Mantle's cave-shadowed silence, the trail of enigmas carries us east again, back to Franktown Cave. For if Mantle's puzzle is about unopened depth, Franktown's mystery is about what lies above an upper shelter whose use and meaning remain entirely unexplored. Franktown Site Upper Shelter. Use. Franktown Cave is already famous for its perishable artifacts, moccasins, socks, woven bags. But what often gets overlooked is that much of the cave has never been excavated in full. Above the main shelter where archaeologists uncovered those extraordinary organic remains, there lies an upper level. It has been noted, mapped, and partially surveyed, yet its actual use remains one of Colorado's quieter enigmas. The upper shelter isn't as obvious or accessible as the lower chamber, but that doesn't mean it was empty. Rock shelters, especially multi-level ones, tend to accumulate layers of meaning. One space might be used for storage, another for ritual, another for domestic life. What complicates Franktown is that the lower levels already produced such a diverse record: archaic tools, ceramic pottery, organic artifacts, that the upper level silence feels less like absence and more like a locked room in a house full of whispers. Archaeologists have floated possibilities. Perhaps the upper shelter served as a lookout, a vantage point to watch the surrounding valley. Its elevation would have made it ideal for monitoring movement, herds of animals, neighboring groups, or even weather patterns. Others suggest it could have been a space for specialized activities, perhaps ceremonies that required separation from the everyday life of the main shelter. The lack of excavation means these are only theories, shadows thrown on the wall. There's also the question of preservation. If the lower levels yielded perishable artifacts, what might the upper levels conceal? Could there be more textiles, tools, or even artwork that survived by sheer accident of environment? Or, alternatively, was the upper shelter less favorable for preservation, meaning that whatever was left there has already vanished into dust? The frustrating truth is that until someone digs, we simply don't know. And this raises a deeper point. Why was the upper shelter never fully studied? Part of the answer lies in logistics. Archaeology requires funding, labor, and justification. If the main chamber already offered extraordinary finds, there may have been little appetite to risk destabilizing the site by opening more. Another part of the answer is patience. Sometimes archaeologists deliberately leave parts of a site untouched, hoping that future generations with better technology will unlock it without the destructive methods of today. The upper shelter remains in limbo, caught between curiosity and caution. That limbo is its own kind of mystery. It reminds us that silence in archaeology isn't always natural, it can be imposed by human choice. The upper shelter is a blank page we have chosen not to read, even though it sits right above us. For now, Franktown's upper level remains a metaphorical attic. We know it's there. We suspect it holds stories. But until someone climbs up and looks inside, we can only imagine. Was it domestic, ceremonial, defensive, or symbolic? Did it mirror the uses of the lower shelter, or did it serve an entirely different function? The questions hang unanswered, a reminder that even when we dig, we rarely finish the story. And while the upper shelter's silence is haunting, the lower levels of Franktown Cave offer another enigma: the patterns of bones themselves. Not just what bones were found, but how they were arranged, clustered, and scattered, a puzzle of behavior that resists easy explanation. Franktown bone assemblage patterns. Bones tell stories. They whisper of meals eaten, animals hunted, rituals performed. But at Franktown Cave, the bones do more than that. They suggest patterns of behavior that we still cannot decode. Excavations uncovered assemblages of animal remains in curious arrangements, clustered in ways that don't quite fit the simple explanation of trash from meals. Instead, the placement of bones hints at something more deliberate, perhaps ceremonial, perhaps social, perhaps something we haven't yet imagined. At first glance, the assemblage looks like any prehistoric midden: deer bones, rabbit remains, fragments of bison and bird. But when studied closely, archaeologists noticed irregularities. Some bones were grouped by species rather than scattered. Others appeared to have been placed in clusters that didn't match natural accumulation or casual discard. Certain bones bore cut marks, as if processed for food, but then ended up in contexts where they served no practical purpose. What does this mean? One theory is that the bone assemblages reflect ritualized disposal. In many cultures, the act of discarding animal remains is itself symbolic. Certain bones might be separated, arranged, or buried as offerings, returning the spirit of the animal to the earth. At Franktown, the unusual clusters could represent ceremonies tied to hunting, feasting, or seasonal cycles. Another theory focuses on social behavior. Perhaps the bone patterns reflect communal meals, where groups gathered, consumed animals, and then deposited the remains in structured ways. The clustering could indicate group identity, a way of marking participation in shared events. Bones arranged together might not represent one meal, but the memory of many, layered in a symbolic act of continuity. Yet another possibility is practical, but still mysterious. Some bones might have been used for tools, ornaments, or pigments, and their clustering reflects activity areas rather than ritual. But if so, why do the patterns resist neat functional categories? Why do they feel intentional in ways that purely utilitarian explanations can't capture? What complicates the story further is the cave's long chronology. Franktown was occupied repeatedly over thousands of years. The bone assemblages don't belong to a single culture or event, but to many, layered on top of one another. That makes interpretation harder. A ritual pattern from one period could overlap with practical use from another, creating palimpsests of meaning that blur together in the archaeological record. For archaeologists, this is maddening. Bones can be measured, cataloged, analyzed chemically. You can determine what animals they came from, how they were butchered, even what season they were killed. But the why, the human intention behind their arrangement, remains elusive. The Franktown assemblages sit on that threshold, where science gives us data but refuses us narrative. Standing in the cave, you can imagine the possibilities. Hunters gathering in winter, feasting on deer, then carefully placing bones in symbolic clusters. Or families using the cave as a base camp, discarding bones in activity areas that later seem patterned to us. Or shamans arranging remains in ritual patterns that spoke to cosmology, not cuisine. Each scenario is plausible, none provable. The irony is that bones, which seem so durable, can be as slippery as language. They preserve fragments of action but erase intention. At Franktown, they whisper of lives lived, rituals performed, meals shared, but they don't resolve into a single story. And so the bone assemblages join the growing list of Colorado's archaeological riddles, patterns without translations, arrangements without captions. They leave us with the same question that haunts Mantle's Cave, Cedar Point, and Mesa Verde. How much of human behavior can truly be known, and how much will forever remain silence disguised as evidence? From here, the trail of enigmas continues deeper into Franktown's record. If bones confuse us, then the next layer, the mystery of shifting population densities during the Middle Ceramic period, complicates things even further. Why did numbers swell, then suddenly decline? What forces drove people away from a cave that had sheltered generations? Franktown. Population changes. Franktown Cave is a place of continuity. People came back again and again over thousands of years, leaving behind layers of stone, fiber, and bone. Yet continuity does not mean stability. When archaeologists sifted through the sediments, they noticed a strange demographic pulse. During the Middle Ceramic period, the population density inside the cave seems to have dropped. Why would a site that served as a reliable shelter for centuries suddenly lose its appeal? The Middle Ceramic period, roughly 900 to 1150 CE, was a time of transformation across the Southwest. Farming was spreading, pottery production was diversifying, and communities were becoming more complex. In some regions, populations boomed. In others, people abandoned long-standing sites. Franktown fits the latter category. After steady use, the evidence of occupation thins. Fewer hearths, fewer artifacts, less intensity overall. By the late ceramic period, use picked up again, but for a time, Franktown seems to have fallen out of favor. Explanations come in many flavors. Some point to climate. Dendrochronology records suggest this period included droughts across parts of the southwest. Perhaps conditions made the cave less appealing, less game in the surrounding valleys, less water in nearby streams, less productivity in the land. If Franktown's users relied on both hunting and small-scale farming, environmental stress could have pushed them elsewhere. Others argue for social causes. Maybe the region's cultural networks shifted. Franktown might have been tied to exchange systems that waned, leaving it peripheral. If neighboring groups consolidated into larger villages, the small rock shelter may have seemed less valuable as a seasonal hub. In other words, Franktown's decline could reflect not environmental stress, but shifting human priorities. There's also the possibility of ritual taboo. Archaeological layers don't tell us about belief systems, but we know from many cultures that sites can suddenly acquire negative significance. A death, a failed ritual, or a perceived imbalance could have marked the cave as undesirable, prompting people to avoid it for generations before returning. The silence of archaeology means we can't confirm this, but the pattern abandonment followed by reoccupation fits. What makes the decline puzzling is that it doesn't seem total. People didn't vanish completely, they simply thinned out. A few artifacts remain from the middle ceramic layers, enough to prove that small groups still came, but the density drop suggests Franktown was no longer a hub, just an occasional stop. The contrast between heavy and light use raises questions about what drove those choices. The mystery is amplified by what came later. By the late ceramic period, Franktown's use intensified again. Pottery reappears in larger numbers, maize residues suggest renewed farming, and occupation layers thickened. Whatever had driven people away was temporary. That cyclical rhythm, occupy, decline, return, haunts the site's history. It reminds us that prehistoric settlement was rarely static. People moved with seasons, with climate, with social winds we can no longer track. Franktown embodies that fluidity. Standing in the cave today, you can feel the absence as much as the presence. The layers tell you people were here, but also when they weren't. And in those gaps, the silence is almost louder than the evidence. What does it mean for a place to fall out of use, only to be rediscovered later? Was it forgotten, then remembered? Or was it always known, but avoided until conditions shifted? From this puzzle of population decline, the story turns back to Mesa Verde's mesa tops. If Franktown's mystery is about when people left, the Sun Temple's exact rituals are about what people did when they stayed. Its walls whisper geometry and astronomy, but the ceremonies enacted within remain shadows, a performance whose choreography we can no longer script. Sun Temple, exact rituals. The Sun Temple at Mesa Verde has always teased archaeologists with its geometry and astronomy. Golden rectangles, alignments to solstices, walls built with a consistent unit of measurement, clear signs of intentional design. But design is not use. Even if we know the builders cared about proportion in the heavens, the crucial question remains: what rituals actually unfolded inside those stone outlines? The problem is absence. No roof beams survive. No ceremonial objects were left in situ. No inscriptions record prayers or chants. What we have is architecture without script, a stage without a surviving playbill. And so, we speculate. Some researchers imagine the Sun Temple as a kind of observatory ritual hybrid. Ceremonies may have been tied to solstices or lunar standstills, with participants marking alignments through firelight or song. Others argue it was purely ritual, geometry serving as symbolic structure rather than practical astronomy. The golden rectangle might not have been about measurement at all, but about harmony, an echo of the universe's balance encoded into sacred space. The temple's unfinished state complicates matters. If the walls were never completed, did rituals ever occur here? Or was the temple abandoned before it could fulfill its purpose? Archaeologists have noted that some stones were placed with extraordinary care, while others look hurried. Was this a project cut short by crisis, drought, conflict? Migration? If so, then the rituals may remain unknown because they never happened. The Sun Temple could be a monument to intention rather than practice. Yet, evidence whispers otherwise. Burn marks on certain stones suggest fire use, perhaps ceremonial flames. Pathways into the structure hint at processional movement, participants entering in specific sequences. The two circular towers inside the rectangle may have served as focal points for rites, possibly linked to cosmology or dualistic symbolism. Even unfinished, the temple might have hosted rituals, improvised, partial, yet potent. The larger puzzle is which rituals. Puebloan traditions across the Southwest include ceremonies tied to agriculture, fertility, rain, ancestors, and celestial cycles. Any of these could have fit the Sun Temple's design, but without direct testimony, we can only guess. Was this a place where priests watched the horizon for the first light of solstice sunrise, chanting prayers for rain? Was it a gathering space where communities enacted creation myths through dance? Or was it a restricted space, open only to elites, where esoteric knowledge of numbers and stars was guarded? Descendant communities sometimes provide hints, though cautiously. Pueblo oral traditions emphasize the sacredness of balance, cycles, and the connection between earth and sky. Some see the Sun Temple as part of that continuum, even if its specific role is lost. But oral tradition also carries silences, secrets kept deliberately, knowledge not shared with outsiders. In this way, the temple remains doubly mysterious, both an archaeological puzzle and a cultural one, locked by respect as much as by time. What unsettles scientists is how precise yet unknowable the site feels. You can measure ratios, map alignments, model astronomy, but when you ask, what did people do here? The evidence dissolves. The Sun Temple becomes an architectural riddle, a building that speaks in geometry rather than words. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the rituals were never meant to be fully understood by anyone outside the circle of participants. The walls encoded mystery into stone, and in doing so ensured that future strangers, archaeologists, tourists, us would stand here in confusion, feeling the absence of meaning as part of the meaning itself. From geometry to ritual, the temple leaves us grasping. But the next question is stranger still. Why that unit of measure, 30.5 centimeters, repeated across its walls? Was it coincidence, practicality, or evidence of an ancient standard, one that hints at a mathematical system we still don't understand? Pueblo unit of measure. The Sun Temple already frustrates scientists with its geometry and alignments, but one detail nags at them with particular persistence: a curious and consistent unit of measure. Across its walls, blocks, and alignments, the same length repeats roughly 30.5 centimeters, or about a foot in modern terms. The repetition is too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Whoever built the Sun Temple wasn't just eyeballing proportions. They were working with a standardized unit. And that revelation drags us into a strange question. Why this measure? Archaeologists stumbled on the pattern by mapping wall lengths and ratios, then noticing how often multiples of 30.5 centimeters appeared. It wasn't random. It looked like someone was counting, repeating, embedding this unit into the very structure of the temple. That discovery was unsettling, because standardized measurement implies more than just craft. It implies a system, a shared knowledge passed between builders. It suggests that numbers mattered, not just for utility, but for meaning. Was the unit practical? 30 centimeters is close to the length of a human forearm, or a step, or perhaps the span of a tool. Standardization could have arisen naturally, from repeating whatever body measure was most convenient. But the builders of the Sun Temple weren't casual. They embedded ratios that reflect golden rectangles and Pythagorean triangles. They worked with precision. If they used a unit, it wasn't just practical, it was deliberate. One theory is that the measure symbolized harmony. By repeating it, builders encoded rhythm into stone. Imagine walking the walls, counting in consistent beats, each block reinforcing a cosmic cadence. The measure becomes more than length, it becomes liturgy, a way of making numbers sacred. Another theory reaches outward. Could this unit connect to broader traditions? 30 centimeters is suspiciously close to measurements found in other ancient sites worldwide. Did the Puebloan builders independently discover a system that resonates with far-off civilizations? Or is this coincidence amplified by our hunger for patterns? Skeptics warn against romanticizing parallels. But the fact remains, the Sun Temple shows measurement that seems more advanced than expected. And then comes the unsettling possibility. Maybe the unit was arbitrary. Maybe it was just what worked best for stacking blocks. But if so, why repeat it with such precision? Why not let variation creep in, as happens in so many vernacular structures? The consistency speaks of intention, and intention demands explanation. For archaeologists, this is maddening. The evidence is right there in stone, but the meaning has evaporated. The unit becomes a ghost of a vanished system, a measurement we can track but not translate. It's a ruler without its culture, a number without its philosophy. Standing on the mesa top, you can feel the irony. The Sun Temple, unfinished and abandoned, still preserves the math of its builders more clearly than their voices. They left us numbers carved into walls, but not the words to explain them. And so, the 30.5 centimeters unit hangs like an unanswered equation, taunting us with the possibility of knowledge just out of reach. And from this puzzle of numbers, we move back to people. On the eastern plains, the Dismal River culture left its own enigmatic traces, including Cedar Point village. But the broader question remains, how did this culture spread, and what connections did Colorado's sites have to the larger Apachean migrations? That question is at the heart of the next mystery, Dismal River culture spread. The Dismal River culture takes its name from a river in Nebraska, but its traces stretch far wider, into Kansas, into Colorado. Associated with early Athabascan-speaking peoples, likely ancestors of the Apache, it occupies a pivotal but murky chapter in prehistory. The Dismal River people built earth lodges, crafted distinctive pottery, and left behind tools that mark them as different from their neighbors. Yet their spread into Colorado raises more questions than it answers. Cedar Point Village, already discussed, is one anchor. But beyond it, other sites in Colorado hint at Dismal River presence. Small earth lodge remains, scattered artifacts, and pottery shards appear across the plains, marking out a cultural footprint. The problem is that the footprint is faint, inconsistent, and often overlaps with other traditions. Were these true Dismal River settlements, or hybrid communities blending styles? The larger puzzle is migration. The Athabascan-speaking ancestors of the Apache and Navajo are believed to have moved south from Canada within the last millennium. The Dismal River culture may represent an early stage of that migration. If so, Colorado was part of the corridor, a transitional zone where groups paused, settled, and adapted before moving further south. But the evidence doesn't line up neatly. Some sites suggest longer occupation, others short-term use. Some pottery matches Dismal River types perfectly, others deviate. It's a story half told, with missing chapters. Why did they spread into Colorado at all? Perhaps climate pushed them, or conflict with other plains groups. Perhaps they were seeking new trade networks or following herds across the plains. Whatever the reason, their presence here complicates the narrative of Apachean origins. It suggests migration was not a single line, but a braided stream, with groups splitting, merging, and adapting as they went. The spread also raises questions of identity. Were these groups already Apache in the cultural sense, or did that identity crystallize later, after further migrations? Archaeologists hesitate to draw straight lines. To label a site Apachean may be tempting, but it risks oversimplifying a dynamic process of transformation. The Dismal River spread shows identity in motion, unfinished, shifting. And then there's the silence. Many Dismal River sites remain understudied, especially in Colorado. Excavations were limited, documentation incomplete, and interpretations outdated. What we know is fragmentary, and what we don't know looms larger. The spread of this culture is visible only in glimpses, like seeing tracks in snow but never the animal itself. For the descendants, the story is more than archaeology. Apache oral traditions trace deep migrations, journeys southward, encounters with other peoples. The Dismal River sites may be fragments of that oral history materialized in earth and pottery, yet archaeology can't fully connect them, it can only hint. Standing on the plains where Dismal River lodges once stood, you see little more than depressions in soil, half erased by grass. But beneath lies a story of movement, of identity in flux, of cultures shaping and reshaping themselves across centuries. And from this enigma of spreading peoples, we return again to Franktown Cave. This time, the puzzle is not population or bones, but food itself specifically, the shifting patterns of corn use. Why did maize adoption fluctuate so strangely in Franktown's record? Why did a crop so central elsewhere arrive late? And what does that delay say about the cave's occupants? Franktown corn usage shifts. If maize is the heartbeat of Pueblo culture, then Franktown Cave complicates the rhythm. Archaeologists studying the site found that corn use didn't follow a neat trajectory. It didn't appear early and expand steadily, as one might expect. Instead, the timeline of maize at Franktown feels disjointed, arriving later than elsewhere, used inconsistently, and sometimes absent altogether. For a crop so central in neighboring regions, this uneven pattern is a riddle. Corn was domesticated in Mexico thousands of years earlier, slowly spreading north through trade and migration. By around 2,000 years ago, it had reached much of the American Southwest, where it transformed societies, permanent villages, irrigation systems, and ceremonial life all grew around maize. But on Colorado's Front Range, the story is different. Franktown Cave shows intermittent adoption. Maize pollen and cobs appear in some layers, vanish in others, then return again. It's as though the people here were experimenting, testing corn's value but never fully committing. Why? Part of the explanation may lie in ecology. Farming on the Front Range is more difficult than in river valleys to the south. Rainfall is erratic, soils are thinner, and frosts threaten crops. Groups here may have been hesitant to depend on maize, instead falling back on hunting and gathering when conditions turned hostile. Corn was useful, but not reliable enough to anchor survival. But environmental limits aren't the whole story. Social factors matter too. Perhaps the groups at Franktown weren't culturally invested in maize in the same way their Puebloan neighbors were. They might have seen it as supplemental food, not a sacred cornerstone. Adoption may have been less about calories and more about identity, choosing when to embrace farming and when to emphasize mobility. The gaps in corn usage raise deeper questions about cultural boundaries. Was Franktown part of the Puebloan world, or was it peripheral, borrowing elements without fully integrating? The archaeological record seems to suggest a liminal status, connected, yet independent. Corn moved north, but at Franktown it never became destiny. And then there's the timing. Some layers show maize use picking up during the late ceramic period, centuries after it was already dominant elsewhere. Why the delay? Perhaps it reflects contact with new groups migrating into the area. Perhaps it represents shifting alliances, where adopting maize was a way of signaling connection. Or perhaps it was necessity, when drought or declining game made farming more attractive. Whatever the reason, the timeline doesn't fit neatly into broader regional models. For archaeologists, Franktown's maize story is frustrating precisely because it resists clarity. Maize is usually a marker. Its presence signals farming, sedentism, new social structures. But here, it signals ambiguity. It refuses to tell us whether Franktown's people were farmers, foragers, or something in between. Standing in the cave, it's easy to imagine the debates that must have unfolded. Do we plant this seed or not? Do we tend a field or follow the herds? Do we trust the rains this year, or hedge our bets with what we know? Those choices, layered across centuries, left behind not definitive answers but fragments, kernels of evidence scattered through soil, hinting at deliberations long since lost. From the enigma of maize, we move to another gap not in farming, but in knowledge itself. Because while corn can vanish and reappear in soil, entire archaeological reports can vanish into archives, never published, never shared. At Franktown, some of the earliest excavations left documentation that was never completed, leaving modern researchers with tantalizing fragments of data but no full account. This lost archaeological documentation is a mystery in its own right, raising questions about how much we've already forgotten not because time erased it, but because people failed to preserve it. Lost archaeological documentation. If archaeology is about recovering the past, then what happens when the records of that recovery vanish? Franktown Cave offers a sobering example. Early excavations at the site, led by researchers like Cap in the mid-20th century, uncovered extraordinary artifacts, perishables, bones, pottery, but many of those findings were never fully published. Reports were drafted, notes scribbled, photographs taken, and then, for reasons still debated, much of it never made it into the public or scholarly record. The result is a paradox. We know remarkable things were found. We have scattered references in later summaries. But the full context, the detailed notes, the stratigraphic diagrams, the artifact inventories is incomplete. It's like being handed puzzle pieces without the box top. You can sense the bigger picture, but you can't reconstruct it. Why were the reports never finished? Funding shortages, personal disputes, shifting priorities all may have played a role. Archaeology in the mid-20th century often depended on limited grants and overworked researchers. Sometimes projects stalled. Sometimes manuscripts languished in drawers. Sometimes the chaos of life intervened and crucial data was simply lost to neglect. But the consequences are profound. Without full records, modern archaeologists can't fully interpret Franktown. They can re-excavate, but they can't replicate the original contexts. Artifacts removed decades ago may now sit in collections, detached from their provenience. Notes may have been discarded or scattered. Each loss erodes the integrity of the story. It's not just Franktown. Across Colorado, early excavations often suffered from the same fate. Sites were dug before modern standards, artifacts were boxed without context, publications were delayed until they evaporated into obscurity. The result is a patchwork record, where some of the most important discoveries exist only as rumors, half-referenced in footnotes. This is its own kind of mystery, the archaeology of archaeology. Instead of puzzling over ancient choices, we puzzle over modern failures. What knowledge was lost because someone never finished a report? What insight slipped away because data wasn't preserved? We'll never know. And that silence is haunting. It's not the silence of vanished cultures, but of vanished scholarship. The cave still holds stories, but our access to them has been narrowed by human forgetfulness. The missing documentation becomes another layer of absence, another gap in a record already full of voids. Standing in Franktown Cave today, archaeologists not only confront the mysteries of prehistoric life, they confront the mysteries of their own discipline. Every trowel stroke uncovers not just ancient silence, but also the silence left by colleagues who didn't or couldn't finish their work. And so, from lost papers, we turn to lost ice. High in Colorado's mountains, climate change is melting patches of ancient snow and ice, revealing artifacts frozen for centuries. These ice patch finds open an entirely new window into prehistory, yet they also raise unsettling questions about what remains hidden and what will vanish before we can save it. Ice patch finds. High in the Colorado Rockies, where the air thins and the snow clings long after spring has melted from the valleys, patches of ancient ice have begun to retreat. At first, these ice patches looked like just another symptom of climate change seasonal features shrinking under warming skies. But as they melted, they began to reveal something extraordinary. Artifacts preserved for centuries, even millennia, hunters' tools, wooden shafts, fragments of clothing, things that should have rotted away long ago, but instead were sealed in ice, waiting. These ice patch finds are among the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of recent decades. Unlike stone or bone, wood and fiber rarely survive in Colorado's climate. But in these frozen time capsules, preservation is astonishing. A spear shaft can emerge from the ice as though it was dropped yesterday, even though it may be 1,000 years old. The implications are enormous. For the first time, archaeologists can glimpse the organic side of prehistoric life in the alpine world. Yet the finds raise more questions than they answer. Why were people at such high elevations in the first place? What were they doing? Thousands of feet above the valleys where farming and settlement usually took place. The artifacts suggest hunting. Bighorn sheep, elk, and other alpine game would have drawn groups into the tundra. Ice patches themselves may have been key animals. Seek them out in summer for coolness and relief from insects, concentrating herds in predictable spots. Hunters, knowing this, may have lain in wait. But beyond the practical lies the symbolic. For many cultures, high mountains are sacred. Ascents are not just physical, but spiritual, encounters with the sky, with ancestors, with forces larger than life. Were the objects found in the ice purely practical hunting tools? Or were some of them offerings? Were they lost by accident, or deliberately left behind in ceremonies we can no longer reconstruct? The line between tool and symbol blurs when preservation is this uncanny. Another layer of mystery comes from timing. Some artifacts date to periods when alpine use was thought to be minimal. If people were up here more often than we assumed, it challenges models of prehistoric mobility. Were mountain hunts seasonal rituals, with communities gathering at high elevations each summer? Were they emergency strategies in times of scarcity? Or were they more central to life than we have realized, with mountains serving as consistent resources rather than occasional expeditions? Complicating all of this is the urgency. Ice patches are melting faster than archaeologists can study them. Each summer reveals new artifacts, but also risks destroying them. Once exposed, organic material begins to decay. What survived for 1,000 years can vanish in weeks if not recovered. Archaeologists race against time, trying to document what they can before climate change erases it forever. And so, the ice patch finds become both revelation and warning. They give us glimpses of lives lived in the high mountains, but they also remind us of how fragile those glimpses are. They are mysteries that melt as we touch them, stories dissolving even as we try to listen. From the frozen silence of the alpine tundra, we descend into the plains again, to a different kind of enduring enigma, the rock art at Agate Bluff. Unlike tools locked in ice, these carvings are etched into stone, exposed to wind and Sunday. Yet their meanings remain just as elusive, their spirals and figures whispering a language that refuses to be fully translated. Agate, bluff, rock art. Meaning, on the eastern plains of Colorado, near the Arkansas River, lies Agate Bluff, a sandstone escarpment marked by hundreds of petroglyphs. Unlike the frozen artifacts of the Rockies, these carvings are visible to anyone who visits figures, spirals, grids, and abstract designs pecked into the stone. They've been there for centuries, enduring weather and time. Yet for all their visibility, their meaning remains cloaked in uncertainty. The petroglyphs at Agate Bluff range from recognizable animals to enigmatic symbols. Bison, deer, and birds appear, etched with simple lines that still convey motion. Human-like figures dance across the stone, some with headdresses, others with outstretched arms. Spirals and geometric forms dominate entire panels, repeating endlessly, as though marking something crucial. But crucial to whom, and in what language? That is the riddle. Some archaeologists argue the art is shamanic. The spirals and abstract shapes resemble imagery from altered states of consciousness, visions translated into stone. In this reading, the panels are records of spiritual journeys, cosmological maps, not literal depictions. Others see them as territorial markers, signs placed to assert presence or warn outsiders. Still, others propose practical uses: calendars, star charts, agricultural guides. Each interpretation is plausible, none definitive. The diversity of styles complicates things. Agate Bluff's art wasn't made in a single moment. It spans centuries, with layers of meaning piled atop one another. What was sacred to one group may have been decorative to another. Some carvings may have been reinterpreted across generations, their original intent forgotten but their forms repurposed. The panels are palimpsests, eras inscribed over eras, leaving us with fragments of multiple languages we can't fully separate. There's also the question of audience. Who was meant to see these images? Were they public, visible to anyone who passed, or were they coded messages meant only for initiates? The sheer scale of the panels suggests communal significance, but scale does not guarantee transparency. Some messages may have been intentionally opaque, their meanings restricted to those who knew the rituals. For us, that opacity becomes permanent. Modern Puebloan traditions sometimes echo the motifs at Agate Bluff. Spirals, for example, remain powerful symbols tied to migration, the sun, and cycles of life. But direct continuity is hard to prove. Oral traditions preserve themes, not literal translations. Agate Bluff could be both ancestral memory and independent expression, tied to a cultural logic we can't quite reconstruct. And then there's the haunting irony. The rock art is durable yet fragile. Panels have been vandalized, eroded, even quarried. What remains may be only a fraction of what once existed. We are trying to decode a story missing half its chapters. The gaps invite speculation, but speculation can only take us so far. Standing before the panels, the effect is uncanny. The carvings don't feel like decoration. They feel like communication messages pressed into stone by hands that wanted to be remembered, but not necessarily understood. The silence of interpretation becomes part of the experience. You know you are looking at meaning, but you don't know what it island. Agate Bluff closes the circle of Colorado's prehistoric enigmas. From cliff dwellings to caves, from lost names to melted artifacts, from vanished people to vanished reports, the state is littered with mysteries that refuse neat endings. Each puzzle, whether frozen, carved, or buried, reminds us that history is not a solved equation. It is a dialogue with absence. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. Not what we've found, but what we never will. Colorado's past is a landscape of silence punctuated by echoes. We press our ears to the stone, the ice, the soil, hoping for answers. What we hear instead is a whisper that says, "You are too late, and that is the point."